Welcome, my friend. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether you're lying in bed after a long day, driving through quiet evening streets, or sitting by a dim lamp with your thoughts drifting, I'm grateful you're here. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? I always love knowing how our stories travel across the world, from one quiet room to another, from one resting soul to the next. Tonight's video is a soft journey, a slow, candlelit walk through India's entire historical tapestry, from its earliest civilizations to the dawn of independence and beyond. You will not need to remember dates, battles, or the names of emperors. All I ask is that you let the story carry you, gently, like a warm current of air moving through an old corridor. We will wander through the ancient streets of Harappa, where the first footprints of Indian civilization still sleep beneath the soil, and we'll pause beneath the cool shade of Ashoka's stone pillars, where a warrior king once whispered to himself that there must be a better way to rule. You'll hear about golden ages of learning, when scholars looked up at the stars and wrote poetry that still glows softly today. And you'll drift through the rise and fall of the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, where marble domes, fragrant gardens, and the quiet ache of love shape the world in ways books can barely describe. As the night deepens, we'll walk through India's more difficult passages, the arrival of traders who became rulers, the stories of rebellion and heartbreak, the quiet strength of those who resisted without raising a sword. You will feel the turning of history not as loud explosions, but as the steady heartbeat of millions of ordinary people whose names we may never know. And when the tale reaches the modern era, freedom, division, rebuilding, you will hear it not as a list of political events, but as the story of a nation learning to breathe again after centuries of struggle. This video is meant to help you relax, to help you fall asleep, or simply to fill your night with a sense of calm curiosity. My storytelling is slow, warm, and gentle. No sudden sounds, no harsh descriptions, just a soft invitation to let your mind wander through time. If your eyes begin to close while listening, that is perfectly fine. Let the past hold your thoughts for a while, like a lullaby woven from memory. Before we begin this long journey together, I want to gently ask you something. If you find peace, comfort, or meaning in these bedtime history videos, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you know. It allows this calm space to grow, and it lets me continue making stories that help you drift into rest while learning something beautiful, something true, something human. And again, just tell me, even in the comments, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? I love hearing your answers. They remind me that even though we are separated by oceans, time zones, and languages, we gather here in the same quiet moment, sharing the same soft light of history. So now, relax. Settle into your pillow or your chair. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of today loosen its grip on your shoulders. Tonight we begin the entire story of India, a story as old as riverbeds and as young as a tomorrow, a story meant to help you sleep, to help you dream, and to help you remember that across all time, humanity has always searched for meaning, for beauty, for belonging. Welcome, my friend. Let's begin. Tonight you are listening to second part 1 of this long, gentle journey about India, and this part is about the soft, quiet beginning of ancient India, the first dawn of a land that did not yet know it would be called India. Long before empires, temples, and kings with shining crowns, there was only a wide, silent land stretching under the sky. Great rivers wandered like slow, silver snakes, carrying cold water from the high mountains. Forests breathed in the dark, and the wind moved softly over empty plains. In this early time, there were small groups of people moving from place to place, looking for food, water, and a safe place to rest their children at night. They did not think of themselves as part of a country or a kingdom or a civilization. They were simply people who wanted one simple thing: to live, to eat, and to feel some kind of peace in a world that was still full of unknown shadows. Deep inside, even if they did not have words for it, they had a quiet wish, a wish for a home that would last longer than one season, longer than one flood, longer than one lifetime. In the cool evenings, when the fire burned low and stars opened above them, these early families sat together and listened to the sounds of the night. Children asked questions. Why does the river sometimes rise and sometimes fall? Why does the sky change its colours every day? Where does the sun go when it walks away from them? The elders did not always have clear answers, but they had stories. They told of spirits in the trees, of great animals who carried the world on their backs, of a sky that could listen if you spoke softly enough. Under those stories was another, quieter desire, the desire to understand the land around them, to turn fear into meaning. They did not only want food and safety, they wanted to feel that their days had a purpose, that their small lives were part of something larger and more gentle than the storms. That wish, soft and almost invisible at first, was like a tiny seed inside the heart of ancient India. But this wish lived side by side with many fears. Life was hard. The people had simple tools made of stone and bone. Their shelters could be blown away by strong winds or washed out by sudden rain. If the hunt failed, their stomachs stayed empty. A strange illness, a wild animal, a broken leg, any of these could bring the end very quickly. Inside each person, there was a constant tension. Should they move on to find better land, or stay and try to build something more permanent here? Should they trust the river that sometimes gave them fish and water, but sometimes rose up and flooded everything they owned? Some elders preferred the old way, always walking, always ready to escape. Others looked at the rich dark soil near the rivers and wondered very quietly if the land itself was inviting them to stay. This was the inner struggle of early people in India, the tug of war between old habits and new dreams, between fear of change and longing for a stable home. Outside of their hearts, the world could be harsh and indifferent. The rivers could swell without warning, swallowing shelters and tools. Hot winds from dry lands could burn the crops they were just learning to plant. Wild animals moved in the forests, tigers, leopards, wolves, their eyes glowing faintly at night just outside the firelight. Sometimes other groups of humans appeared too, carrying different tools, different languages, different tempers. Some came in peace, bringing new ways of making fire or shaping stone. Others came in anger, fighting over hunting grounds or water. To these small communities, the outside world felt like a huge, shifting puzzle that could never be fully controlled. The sky, the weather, the animals, even other people, all of them could become an enemy without warning. This was the stage on which ancient India was born, a land full of gifts, but also full of tests. Yet the people were not alone. They slowly began to notice that some forces in the world felt less like enemies and more like quiet friends if they learned how to work with them. The great rivers, especially in the northwest, flooded, yes, But after the water pulled back, the soil became dark and rich. Seeds dropped into this soil sprouted more easily. Plants grew taller. Grain was easier to store than meat. Children could eat even when no animals were nearby. The rivers became like patient teachers, showing them that if they watched carefully and waited for the right time, the land would answer their efforts. Fire also became a partner, at first only for warmth and safety, then to harden clay, to cook food, to shape metal in later ages. Even the stars became guides, helping them know when seasons would change. In this way, slowly, the world around them turned from a pure threat into a kind of quiet ally. The land was still dangerous, but it was also full of hidden support for those who listened. Step by step, a change began. Some groups chose to stay near certain rivers, returning to the same spots each year. They built stronger huts, first from wood and reeds, then mixing mud to form walls that could stand through the seasons. Small fields appeared near the water's edge. People sowed seeds, waited, worried, and then watched with surprise when green shoots broke through the soil. The first time a child saw a field turn from brown to green, it must have felt like magic, a magic that didn't come from faraway spirits, but from their own hands working with the earth. This was a quiet turning point. Hunting and gathering did not end, but farming slowly joined them. Villages began to form like clusters of stars along the rivers. Paths appeared between them. Trade began in simple forms: a pot for a basket, grain for meat, a story for a tool. The inner fear of staying in one place met the outer promise of a more stable life, and little by little the promise began to win. From above, if one could look down through time, it would seem as if the land itself was drawing people into certain lines, along riverbanks, between gentle hills, near passes where mountains opened like doors. These patterns were the first outlines of what would one day become famous cities and kingdoms. But at this early stage, there were no kings, no flags, no names written in stone. There were only families, fires, fields, and stories. Still, something important had changed. The wish for a lasting home was no longer just a thought inside a few brave minds. It was becoming visible in the world, in the shape of villages, in the rhythm of sowing and harvest, in the way people buried their dead near the same places where the living children played. A kind of memory, larger than any one person, was beginning to form. As night falls over this distant age, imagine the soft glow of many small fires scattered across the early Indian land, like gentle stars fallen onto the earth. Smoke rises into a deep, dark sky. Rivers move in slow silence, carrying the reflection of the moon. Children fall asleep to the murmurs of their parents, who speak of the land as if it were a living being that might one day truly accept them. They do not know the names we use now: India, Indus, Ganges, civilization, history. They only know the feel of the soil in their hands, the warmth of another body next to them in the cold, and the quiet hope that tomorrow the land will still welcome them. Somewhere in that wide darkness, the first faint outline of a great civilization is breathing in, and breathing out like a sleeper just beginning to dream. Tonight you are listening to Part 2, and this part is about the Indus Valley civilization, those calm, careful cities that grew like quiet patterns along the ancient rivers of northwestern India and Pakistan. Long after the first families had chosen to stay beside the water, small villages began to change in a very special way. Instead of scattered huts placed wherever there was space, people started to think in lines, squares, and plans. They noticed that when houses were arranged neatly, when streets lined up, When drains carried dirty water away, life became a little smoother, a little safer, a little more peaceful. Along the wide, slow river we now call the Indus and its branches, a new kind of human dream was taking shape. The dream of a city that did not just happen, but was gently designed. In places we would later call Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, the earth began to hold those dreams in baked bricks, straight roads, and quiet courtyards. The people of these river cities wanted something simple but very deep: order and dignity. They wished for a life where each day did not feel like chaos. They wanted to know that when they woke up in the morning, water would be nearby, streets would be dry, markets would be open, and their children could play safely between the walls. They wanted their work to mean something, the potter shaping clay for a household he would never see, the brickmaker stacking blocks that would hold up the second floor of a stranger's home, the trader watching boats slide along the river, carrying beads and grain and cotton to lands he would never visit. Their desire was not only for wealth, it was for a calm rhythm: harvest, store, trade, sleep, repeat. In their neat streets and careful drains, you can still feel this wish for a life that flowed like a steady river, not like a violent storm. Yet, even inside such organized cities, there were quiet tensions. To keep order is never easy. Some people longed for more freedom, more color, more noise. Maybe a young builder wanted to experiment with a new style of house, but the city plan demanded that all streets remain straight and all walls line up. Maybe a trader dreamed of taking bigger risks, sailing farther away, while elders urged him to be cautious and follow the old routes. There may have been people who felt that the rules were too many, that the city's clean lines pressed on their spirit like tight clothes. Others, especially those who remembered the older, harder days of wandering, believed that rules were the only thing standing between them and disaster. Inside every calm civilization there is this soft tug of war between the comfort of structure and the pull of personal desire, between the wish to keep everything the same and the quiet urge to grow into something new. Outside the city walls, the world still had a mind of its own. The Indus River could be a kind friend or a sudden threat. Some years, the floods brought rich mud that fed the crops. In other years, the water might rise higher than anyone expected, breaking banks, drowning fields, and carving new channels through the earth. The sky could hold back rain for too long, leaving cracks in the soil and worry in every farmer's eyes. There may have been earthquakes, tremors, felt under bare feet, reminding people that even the ground they trusted could shake without warning. Far away, other groups moved across the plains and mountains, bringing new languages, new ways of living, and sometimes new conflicts. The people of the Indus cities could control the lines of their streets and the shape of their houses, but they could not fully control the river, the climate, or the slow movements of other peoples around them. These were the outside forces pressing on their carefully built world. To face these challenges, they leaned on their tools, their knowledge, and each other. They learned to fire bricks in kilns so that walls would not wash away when the river rose. They built drainage systems that carried waste out of the city, keeping their homes cleaner and the air fresher than in many later civilizations. They used careful weights and measures so that trade would be fair and trust could grow between buyer and seller. They crafted seals with tiny animal designs that marked goods and told silent stories of who had made them and where they came from. Over generations, this quiet technology became like a set of wise teachers. The bricks taught them patience and planning. The drains taught them about hygiene. The weights taught them about fairness, and the seals taught them about identity and memory. The city itself became a kind of gentle guardian, guiding each new child born within its walls to move in ordered paths, to follow rhythms that had been tested by time. In this long, calm process, there were still moments that felt like turning points, even if no one wrote them down. Perhaps there was a season when one of the cities decided to rebuild on a higher mound after a great flood, lifting itself above the reach of the water. Perhaps there was a time when new trade links opened, reaching far toward Mesopotamia, and people saw strange goods in their markets, different metals, unusual beads, new ideas. Or maybe there was a gradual thickening of the city's life, more workshops, more granaries, more people arriving from the countryside, drawn to the safety of walls and the promise of regular food. At some quiet point, these places stopped being just big villages and truly became cities with their own heartbeat, the rhythm of feet on brick streets, the murmur of voices in markets, the soft clink of tools, and the splash of water drawn from wells. Without fanfare, the Indus Valley civilization reached its gentle peak, a high plateau of steady life, rather than a sharp mountain of conquest. But no plateau lasts forever. Over time, signs of strain began to appear, like small cracks in a seemingly solid wall. The river may have changed its course bit by bit, leaving some fields dry and others waterlogged. Maybe the land became tired from too much use. Trade routes could have shifted as other powers rose in distant lands. Some scholars today think climate change played a role, drying the land and making harvests less secure. Others wonder about disease or political troubles inside the cities. We do not know for sure, and historians still debate softly among themselves, almost like people speaking in a quiet library, trying not to disturb the sleeping past. What we can see is that many of the great cities were slowly abandoned. Houses were left empty. Bricks tumbled. The streets, once swept clean, gathered dust and wind-blown sand. The careful pattern loosened, as if a hand that had been holding the city together finally grew tired and let go. For the people who lived through that slow unravelling, it must have been confusing and painful. A family might have watched as neighbours moved away, one by one, until whole sections of the city felt hollow. Markets that were once full became thin, with fewer stalls, fewer voices, less colour. Children who had grown used to the straight streets and sturdy walls may have asked their parents why they had to leave, why the place that had always felt so safe now felt uncertain and fragile. There was, in those final days, a deep internal struggle. Should they cling to the old walls and hope things would improve, or should they follow the rumour of better land elsewhere, even if it meant losing the comfort of all they had built? No matter which choice they made, they carried with them a memory that humans could live in clean, ordered cities, that they could plan, measure, and shape their environment with care. That memory did not vanish even when the bricks cracked and the drains filled with dust. Tonight, as you lie still, you can imagine walking slowly through one of those empty streets long after everyone has gone. The moonlight slips along the tops of broken walls. A silent well waits in the centre of a courtyard, its water level low but not gone. Somewhere, a single pot lies on its side, half buried in the sand, its curve still smooth under your fingertips. The air is quiet now, but it carries a faint echo of footsteps, voices, and distant river song. In that soft, abandoned place, you can feel both the rise and the fading of a civilization that once believed it could place its life into perfect lines. And far beyond these sleeping bricks, other lands of the subcontinent are waiting in the dark, ready to grow into new kingdoms and new dreams under the same patient sky. Tonight, you are listening to Part 3, and this part is about Emperor Ashoka and the quiet turning of a great Indian empire from war toward an inner path of dharma and peace. Many years have passed since the Indus cities faded and new kingdoms rose across the subcontinent. Among them, the Maurya Empire grew like a vast tree, its branches stretching from the Himalayas in the north to deep into the south, from the lands near Persia in the west to the Bay of Bengal in the east. At the centre of this tree stood a powerful trunk, the Mauryan royal family in Pataliputra. Ashoka was born into this world of power, palaces, and careful politics. As a young prince, he walked through long stone corridors, saw warriors in armour, listened to advisors whispering about alliances and rebellions. From his earliest days, he understood that in this world, strength and fear often ruled more loudly than kindness. The empire was big, and to hold it together, his family used armies, spies, and strict laws. This was the ground on which Ashoka first learned what it meant to be a ruler. Inside his heart, the young Ashoka carried a strong desire. He wanted to be more than just another prince in a long line. He wanted to prove himself, to show that he could hold the empire together, maybe even make it larger, more glorious. He dreamed of victories that would make his name echo beyond his lifetime. When he looked at maps, his eyes were drawn to the spaces not yet under Mauryan control, especially a rich and proud region called Kalinga, near the eastern coast. Conquering Kalinga would mean closing a gap, turning the empire into a more complete shape, like a circle instead of a broken line. In his mind, and in the minds of many around him, this seemed like a natural and necessary goal. To rule strongly, they thought, was to conquer strongly. His wish, at that time, was sharp and clear. Expand the empire, prove his power, make the Mauryan name unshakable. But even in those early days, small doubts may have moved quietly in the back of his mind, like soft shadows behind a bright curtain. Ashoka was not only a soldier or a politician, he was also a human being who could see faces, not just numbers. When he visited towns, he saw children playing in dusty streets, old people resting in the shade, farmers bending over their fields. He knew that every decision made in the polished halls of the palace would ripple out into these simple lives. Somewhere inside, he must have felt a question. How much pain is acceptable for the sake of an empire? How many tears can be justified by the promise of glory? These questions did not stop him, not yet, but they were seeds. And like all seeds, they waited for the right moment to break open. Outside the palace walls, the world of Ashoka's time was full of hard edges. Kingdoms watched each other with cautious eyes. Envoys went back and forth, carrying gifts and threats hidden in polite words. Armies trained relentlessly, steel meeting steel, bows bending, chariots rolling over dry earth. The land of Kalinga stood proudly, with its own rulers, its own warriors, its own sense of honour. To the Mauryas, Kalinga was a missing piece of the puzzle. To Kalinga, the Mauryas were a dangerous giant at the door. The rivers, the hills, the roads along the coast, all of these became lines in a quiet but growing tension. The outside forces pushed Ashoka in one clear direction: strike now or risk looking weak. Around him, generals spoke of strategy, advisors spoke of opportunity, and the drums of war echoed like a distant storm drawing closer. Still, Ashoka did not walk alone into that storm. Around him were people and ideas that would later help him in ways he could not yet imagine. In his empire, holy men moved from village to village, sharing teachings about karma, compassion, and the cycle of rebirth. There were followers of older Vedic traditions, wandering thinkers who asked deep questions about the soul, and there were also quiet Buddhists carrying the memory of the Buddha's gentle path: do not harm, understand suffering, seek peace inside yourself. At first, these voices were only soft sounds at the edge of the royal world, like distant bells carried by the wind. Ashoka heard them, but did not yet live by them. His closest helpers in the early years were his soldiers, his officers, the architects of war and administration. But life was slowly arranging the pieces. Wise counselors, spiritual teachers, and the still living influence of the Buddha were all waiting in the wings, ready to step forward when the time was right. That time came in the great confrontation with Kalinga. The war did not begin as a quiet thing. Battle lines formed, flags lifted, commands shouted. On plains and near rivers, thousands of men faced each other with swords, spears, and arrows. The clash was fierce. For a ruler planning on maps, battles can seem neat and clean, like pieces moving on a board. But for Ashoka, walking across the battlefield afterward, the reality was not neat at all. Bodies lay on the ground, broken and still. Horses and elephants, creatures who had trusted their human masters, lay wounded or dead. Smoke from burning houses rose into a sky that did not care who had won. The wailing of the survivors, mothers, children, people who had lost everything, filled the air. Kalinga was defeated, yes. The empire was now larger, yes. But the price was painted in blood and ash. Standing among that ruin, something inside Ashoka cracked open. The seed of doubt that had slept in his heart finally awoke. The turning point was not a roar, but a deep inner silence. Ashoka looked at what he had done and felt a wave of sorrow rise inside him, heavier than any armor he had ever worn. He realized that the victory he had dreamed of for so long had brought him not pride, but a strange and painful emptiness. The questions that once whispered now spoke clearly. What is the worth of an empire built on this much suffering? What kind of king causes such grief and then calls it glory? In that quiet, shaken space, the softer voices he had once ignored became clearer. The teachings about compassion, about ahimsa, non-violence, about the duty of a ruler to protect, not just to dominate. Ashoka began to listen. He turned toward the path of Dharma, not as a fashionable idea, but as a lifeline. He chose to embrace Buddhism more deeply, to sit with monks, to learn from them, to let their wisdom reshape the way he thought of power. This was the invisible battle inside Ashoka between the old king of conquest and the new king of conscience. From that inner battle came a very different kind of action. Instead of planning new wars, Ashoka began to plan new messages. Across his vast empire, pillars of stone were raised, and rocks were carved with words. These were his edicts, gentle instructions to his people and to himself, to be kind, to avoid needless killing, to treat all religions with respect, to see prisoners not just as enemies but as human beings, to care for animals and travellers, to plant trees and build rest houses. The same hands that had once held swords now helped guide the carving of letters into stone. These pillars and rock edicts became Ashoka's new weapon, if we can even call it that, a weapon of example, of moral guidance. The empire still existed. Armies still stood ready in case of danger, but its heartbeat had changed. The rhythm of marching feet was joined by the quieter rhythm of chisel on stone, spelling out a softer vision of rule. In the years that followed, the Maurya Empire under Ashoka became a carrier of these ideas, sending Buddhist missions to distant lands from Sri Lanka to Central Asia. The map that once showed only territory taken by force now showed paths of teaching spreading like light along old trade routes. Of course, not everything became perfect. There were still problems, still politics, still human weaknesses, but a new possibility had been born in Indian history. The idea that a powerful king could openly regret his violence and try sincerely to turn toward compassion. That idea would echo through the centuries, long after the Maurya Empire itself faded. Tonight, you can imagine one of Ashoka's stone pillars standing alone in a quiet field at dusk. The air is still. Birds circle once or twice and then settle into the trees. The letters carved into the stone are old, worn by wind and rain, but still there, lines of thought reaching out across time. The sun sinks low, turning the sky into a soft wash of gold and blue, and the pillar throws a long, gentle shadow across the ground, like a calm reminder that even in a world shaped by war, a single human heart can turn and turn again toward a different kind of power. Tonight, you are listening to Part 4, and this part is about the Gupta Golden Age, a quiet time when knowledge, art and faith in India opened like flowers at night. Many generations after Ashoka's pillars were raised and the great Maurya Empire faded into the background of memory, the land of India broke into smaller kingdoms like a great lamp that had fallen and scattered its sparks. For a while, things were uncertain. Borders shifted, local rulers argued, and people wondered if there would ever be a time of calm strength again. Slowly, in the north of India, near the old heartlands around the Ganges, one family began to gather these sparks together. They were the Guptas. At first, they were just another regional power, one more branch among many. But over time, through careful marriages, patient diplomacy, and sometimes quiet force, their influence grew. Under kings like Chandragupta, F.R. Samudragupta, and Chandragupta Tsanku, a new shape appeared on the map, a broad, stable realm where trade could flow, temples could rise, and stories could travel safely along the roads. People did not call it a golden age yet. They simply felt that life was becoming a little safer, a little brighter, a little more predictable than before. Inside this growing kingdom, there was a gentle but strong desire, not just to rule, but to refine. The Gupta kings and the people around them wanted more than victory in battle. They wished to polish language, music, sculpture, and thought the way a jeweller polishes a stone. In their courts, they wanted poetry that could make listeners feel both peace and wonder. In their temples and shrines, they wanted images of the gods so graceful that people felt comfort just by looking at them. In their schools, they wanted mathematics and astronomy that could make sense of patterns in the sky and patterns in numbers, so that the world would feel a little less random, a little more understandable. It was as if the whole society had a shared dream to take the rough material of life, stone, word, sound, number, and shape it into something clear and beautiful. This wish for refinement, for quiet excellence, became the heartbeat of the Gupta era. But even in this time of promise, there were inner struggles. The same people who enjoyed fine poetry and delicate sculptures also lived in a world where hunger, disease, and fear still existed. A scholar might spend long nights calculating the paths of planets, yet worry about his family's safety if war ever returned. A poet might write about divine love and cosmic order, yet feel jealous of another poet praised more loudly at court. A king might proudly support learning and temples, yet feel a dark tug inside to prove his strength in war and expansion. There was also a tension between the call of the spirit and the pull of everyday life. Holy men and philosophers spoke of renouncing wealth and pleasure, searching for truth beyond the world, while merchants and craftsmen felt the practical need to earn, to build, to enjoy the comforts that peace could bring. Inside many hearts, there was a quiet question. How can a person live both wisely and fully, both spiritually and joyfully, in a world that offers so many paths? Beyond the borders of the Gupta realm, the wider world continued to move, sometimes gently, sometimes harshly. To the northwest, new groups of warriors, like the Kushans and later the Huns, rode across Central Asian plains, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding. Sea routes connected India with distant lands, Roman territories, Southeast Asia and beyond, bringing coins, spices, cloth and ideas. Far-off empires rose and fell, and their shocks, like distant thunder, could still be felt in Indian markets and ports. Closer to home, forests, rivers and monsoon winds continued to shape life. A failed monsoon could weaken even a strong kingdom's. A good harvest could fill its treasuries and feed its scholars. The Gupta rulers could build roads and laws, but they could not command the rain or silence the hoofbeats of invaders forever. The outside world was like a slowly changing sky above a carefully tended garden, beautiful but never fully under control. To meet these challenges, the Guptas leaned on their greatest allies, their thinkers, artists and teachers. In quiet rooms, under oil lamps, mathematicians worked with symbols that would someday become the numbers used around the world. They played gently with the idea of nothing and place until the concept of zero and place value began to take shape more clearly, turning hard calculations into something smoother and more powerful. Astronomers watched the stars and planets measuring their movements, trying to understand the great clock of the heavens. Poets like Kalidasa composed plays and epics that described love, duty, nature, and the gods with such soft precision that even today their words are remembered like the scent of a distant flower. Sculptors carved stone into serene faces of deities with calm eyes and gentle smiles that seemed to say, "All storms pass, all souls can find rest." Temples rose with balanced forms, pillars, arches, and carvings that blended strength and grace. In villages and towns, teachers recited old texts and new commentaries, passing on knowledge from one generation to the next, like a flame carefully handed from lamp to lamp, quietly. Through all these efforts, a kind of peak was reached, not a loud, dramatic summit, but a soft, broad, high ground of culture. Trade routes were busy, yet safe enough that merchants dared to travel. Craftsmen produced metalwork, textiles, and jewellery that spoke of skill and patient hands. Cities hummed without screaming. They pulsed with life rather than rattling with chaos. Many different religious paths coexisted. Hindu traditions growing richer and more defined, Buddhism and Jainism still alive and present, local village beliefs continuing as roots beneath the surface. Instead of crushing one another, these beliefs often touched and influenced each other, creating a woven cloth of ideas rather than a single harsh line. For many people living under Gupta rule, daily life offered a balance, enough stability to plan, enough beauty to inspire, and enough freedom to think. If history were a long night's journey, then this period was like a stretch of road lit by many small steady lamps. Of course, no golden age is perfectly pure, and none lasts forever. The same softness that allowed art and learning to bloom could also make the edges of the empire weaker against hard riders from outside. Over time, pressures grew. Regional governors wanted more independence. Frontier defences felt strain, and new waves of invaders tested the kingdom's strength. The Gupta rulers who came later did not always have the same skill, patience, or good fortune as their ancestors. Piece by piece, territories slipped away. tax revenue thinned, local powers rose again, remembering their old ambitions. To the common people, the change might have felt gradual, a little less safety on the roads, a little more fear of bandits, a little uncertainty about tomorrow's harvest or next year's ruler. Still, even as political lines on the map broke apart, something more subtle remained. The knowledge, the art, the stories created in this age did not vanish with the fall of Gupta power. They lingered in manuscripts, in temple walls, in the memories of students who became teachers themselves. As you rest and listen now, you might imagine walking at dusk through a Gupta-era city at its quiet height. The sun is low, painting roofs and temple towers in soft gold. Somewhere, a group of children repeats a lesson in a sing-song rhythm. A sculptor wipes stone dust from his hands and steps back to look at the half-finished face of a deity, calm eyes already taking shape. In a shaded courtyard, an old teacher traces numbers in the dust, speaking softly to a young student about how even nothing can hold a place in a line of digits. Not far away, a poet leans on a balcony, watching the first stars appear, searching for the right word to describe the feeling of night rising over a peaceful city. A breeze moves through narrow streets, carrying the smell of food, incense, and wet earth after a light rain. Above it all, the sky grows deeper and darker, holding within it the quiet truth that golden ages always pass. But the gentle light they leave behind can continue to glow, very softly, in the minds and hearts of those who come later. And somewhere beyond that darkening horizon, new kingdoms, new struggles, and new awakenings are quietly waiting their turn. Tonight, you are listening to part 5, and this part is about the first quiet footsteps of Buddhism in India, how one man's inner search became a soft path that millions would follow. To understand the gentle ideas that later touched Ashoka and echoed through the Gupta age, we have to walk back in time to northern India, to a world of small kingdoms, wandering holy men, and deep questions about life and suffering. In the foothills near the Himalayas, where mornings are cool and the air smells of damp earth and leaves, there was a small kingdom called the Shakya realm. There, in a palace with carved pillars and shaded courtyards, a prince named Siddhartha was born into comfort and safety. His family wanted him to have everything: soft clothes, rich food, music, and the best teachers. The palace walls were like warm arms, holding him away from anything ugly or frightening. For a while it worked. His world seemed complete, like a beautiful painting with no cracks in the frame. Inside Siddhartha, however, there lived a quiet desire that was different from the hopes of his family. The king, his father, wished for him to become a strong ruler, a man of power and victory, someone who would keep the kingdom safe and bring glory to their name. But Siddhartha, even as a young man, felt pulled towards something less loud and more mysterious. He wanted to understand why people, even in a rich and well-protected palace, still felt moments of sadness, fear, and emptiness. He wondered why joy never seemed to last, why the glow of pleasure always faded, like the colour of the sky after sunset. The more he thought, the more he felt that his life, no matter how comfortable, was missing a deeper truth. He did not yet know what he was seeking, only that his heart was not satisfied with silks, feasts, and praise. His wish was not for a bigger kingdom outside, but for a clearer, calmer kingdom inside himself. Still, this inner wish did not sit easily within the life he had been given. There was a tension that grew quietly, day by day. Part of him wanted to obey his father, to be a good prince, a loving husband and father, a loyal son. Walking away from all of that felt like betrayal, like breaking something sacred. Another part of him could not ignore the questions that haunted him in the stillness of the night. Why do people grow old? Why do bodies become sick? Why do we die? Is there any peace that does not vanish when these things arrive? He tried for a time to push these thoughts aside, to lose himself in the pleasures of palace life. But each time he did, the questions returned like a soft knocking at a locked door. The more he resisted, the heavier his heart became. Siddhartha was trapped between two worlds, the tidy, planned future that others wanted for him, and the unknown road of spiritual search that called him in the dark. Outside the palace walls, the world refused to stay hidden. One day, on carefully arranged trips beyond his protected life, Siddhartha saw what he had been shielded from. An old man with bent back and shaking hands, a sick person with pain in his eyes, a dead body being carried to its resting place. He also saw a wandering holy man, thin but calm, walking with bare feet and steady steps. These sights struck him like gentle but unanswerable riddles. Age, sickness, and death were not exceptions. They were part of the fabric of existence. No palace, no wealth, no army could keep them away forever. And yet, in the holy man's face, there was a kind of quiet that did not seem broken by these truths. This contrast became the outside force pushing Siddhartha's inner crisis to a breaking point. The world was clearly full of suffering. But maybe, just maybe, there was also a path that allowed a person to face this suffering without being crushed by it. The question burned softly but steadily in his mind. He was not entirely alone in facing these questions. Across India at that time, many seekers called sannyasis or shramanas were leaving their homes to wander in forests and along dusty roads, testing different paths, strict fasting, deep meditation, complex rituals, sharp debates, to find the nature of reality. Ancient teachings in the Vedas and Upanishads whispered of a deeper soul, of a truth beyond ordinary life. There were teachers in schools, hermitages by rivers, groves where students sat at the feet of gurus, learning methods to quiet the mind. These were Siddhartha's potential allies, even though he did not know them yet. They represented the accumulated wisdom and mistakes of many lifetimes of searching by many people. When Siddhartha finally chose to leave the palace one silent night, riding away from his sleeping family under the watch of pale stars, he was stepping into a web of existing practices and ideas that would both guide him and test him. The journey that followed was not simple or immediately successful. Siddhartha tried the paths that others said would lead to liberation. He trained his mind, held his breath, sat in deep meditation for long periods. With 5 other seekers, he practiced extreme fasting, eating so little that his body became thin and weak, his ribs like lines carved under his skin. His will was strong, but his body was failing. One day, as he sat near a river, dizzy with hunger, he realized that this path of self-torture was just another form of imbalance, a mirror image of the rich life he had left behind. Overindulgence had not brought him peace, but neither did harsh denial. There had to be a middle way, a path that honored the body without being enslaved by it, that respected the mind without letting it be dragged by every desire and fear. This insight was like a small flame in the dark, fragile but real. He accepted a simple bowl of food from a village girl, letting go of the pride that had driven him to extremes, and walked alone to sit beneath a fig tree, the Bodhi tree, with a quiet vow. He would not rise until he had seen the truth for himself. What happened beneath that tree is described in many stories, told in many ways, but all agree on its gentle depth. Night fell, and Siddhartha faced within himself the roots of fear, desire, and ignorance. Temptations came, not as monsters outside, but as thoughts inside. Doubts, old cravings, memories of comfort, fears of failure. He watched them without running, without clinging. He saw that everything that arises in the mind also passes, like clouds across the sky. As dawn approached, something in him opened. He saw in a clear and simple way the chain that links suffering to craving and ignorance, and the possibility of breaking that chain through understanding, ethical living, and mindful awareness. He saw what would later be called the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, not as dry rules, but as a living way to walk through life with less harms, less confusion, more compassion. In that quiet hour, as birds began to stir and the first light touched the leaves, Siddhartha became the Buddha, the awakened one, not a god, but a human being who had truly woken up. After his awakening, the Buddha did not keep this understanding locked inside like a secret jewel. Instead, he rose and began to walk. He returned first to the 5 seekers who had once been his companions, and then left him when he accepted food. At a place called Sarnath, in a peaceful deer park, he taught them what he had seen. They listened, doubted, questioned, and slowly began to understand. From that small circle, the ripple of his teachings spread outward. Monks and nuns formed communities, sanghas, moving from town to town, begging for food, sitting under trees to meditate, and offering simple lessons to anyone who wanted to listen. Be kind, do not harm, speak truthfully, watch your mind, see how everything changes. The Buddha's allies were not armies or kings at first, but ordinary people who felt that his words explained their own experience of joy and sorrow with gentle honesty. He taught for many years, walking across the dusty roads of northern India, his presence quiet but steady, like a lamp carried carefully through the night, so others could find their way by its light. As time passed, the Buddha grew older, and eventually, like all beings, passed away. His body died, but his teachings did not. They were kept in memory, recited in gatherings, later written down as sutras. Different schools and styles of Buddhism began to appear, some more focused on strict monastic life, others on compassion for all beings, others on deep philosophy about emptiness and form. In India, the new path settled gently into the larger landscape of thought, living alongside older traditions rather than completely replacing them. Kings would one day support these teachings, monasteries would rise, carvings of the Buddha would appear in caves and temples, and even when Buddhism later weakened in India itself, it had already travelled beyond into Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Tibet, China, and further, carrying with it the seed of that first quiet realization under the Bodhi tree. Tonight, if you close your eyes, you can imagine a simple scene. A man in plain robes walking barefoot along a dusty road at sunset, his bowl half full of food, given by strangers, his face calm, his eyes kind. Around him, the world is the same world it has always been. People are still growing old, falling sick, and dying, still laughing, still worrying. But within him, there is a different way of seeing, a way that does not turn away from suffering and does not drown in it either. That way of seeing will travel far, long after his footsteps on the road have faded. Somewhere in the soft darkness of early India, a new path of understanding has been laid down, like a narrow but steady trail through a wide forest, waiting for anyone who wishes to walk it with a quiet, searching heart. Tonight you are listening to Pen Part 6, and this part is about Alexander the Great at India's Western Gate, the moment when a young Macedonian king reached the edge of the Indian world, and both sides saw each other through a hazy, half-dreaming light. By the time Alexander's armies came near the lands that lay west of the Indus, India was already old in its own way. Kingdoms, tribes, and city-states stretched across the plains, forests, and river valleys, each with its own rulers, its own gods, its own ways of life. Far to the west, in Macedon and Greece, stories of this distant region had drifted like soft rumours. A land of strange animals, fine cotton, spices, wise sages, and enormous rivers that flowed like liquid sky. Alexander, who had already crossed mountains and deserts, who had taken cities whose names rang like iron on stone, Thebes, Tyre, Persepolis, began to look toward this unknown place on the edge of his maps, and felt a restless longing awaken inside him. He had been taught stories of heroes like Heracles and Achilles, men who pushed past the known world into wild regions that blurred into myth. Now, standing on the far side of the Persian Empire he had conquered, he wanted something very simple and very large, to keep going, to chase the horizon until there was nothing left to conquer, until his own name covered the earth like a soft echo that never stopped. That wish burned brightly in him, but it also held a more quiet, personal note. Alexander had grown up in a world of expectations and legends. His father Philip had forged Macedon into a powerful kingdom and laid the groundwork for a great campaign against Persia. His mother told him he was of divine blood. His teachers filled his head with tales of gods and warriors. To many people around him, his path seemed laid out: defeat Persia and be remembered as a great king. But Alexander did not want to stop there. Inside, he was driven by a deeper hunger for meaning, a desire to prove that a human being could stretch beyond any limit, that he could stand at the very edge of the known world and say, "I have seen it, I have touched it." The word India floated in his mind not just as a place on a map, but as a symbol of the furthest beyond, the final test of his courage, endurance, and destiny. In the quiet hours between battles, when the campfires burned low and men slept snoring on the ground, Alexander lay awake thinking of that eastern land, imagining its rivers, its kings, and its mysteries, feeling the pull of a road that promised no easy rest. Yet, as his army moved ever farther from home, crossing into the lands near the Hindu Kush and beyond, inner doubts and weariness began to stir, not only in his men, but surely somewhere in him as well. The soldiers had followed him through burning deserts, freezing passes, and brutal sieges. They had left families behind, buried friends far from home, and carried scars that ached at night. When they heard their leader speak again of pushing forward, now toward an even stranger, wetter, hotter world, where the monsoon winds blew and unfamiliar rivers roared, they felt a quiet resistance rise in their hearts. Some wondered if their king's hunger would ever be satisfied. Others feared that each new step eastward was a step away from the possibility of ever going home. Alexander himself, though he spoke with confidence and fire, must have felt these tensions pressing on him, the clash between his boundless ambition and the very human limits of tired bodies, hearts that missed their homeland, minds that feared the unknown jungles and war elephants they were told waited ahead. In that long march, the empire he carried was not only on his maps, it was also inside him, and inside each man who had to decide, day after day, whether to keep walking. Outside their moving camp, the Indian frontier world watched and responded. The land itself shifted, the air grew more humid, the rains heavier, the rivers deeper and broader, forests thickened, full of sounds that were new to Macedonian ears. Monsoon storms swept across the sky, turning roads to mud and rivers into torrents. The people they met spoke unfamiliar languages, wore different clothes, and carried weapons shaped in ways the Greeks had not seen before. Some local rulers chose to ally with Alexander, seeing in him a powerful new force that could help them in their own rivalries. Others stood firm, ready to fight. Among them was King Porus, who ruled a region near the Hydaspes River, what we now call the Jalum. He was tall, strong and proud, and he had something the Macedonians had never faced at scale: war elephants, towering animals whose tusks could be armoured, whose bulk could terrify men and horses. For Alexander's army, these were the external challenges pressing down: unfamiliar climate, endless distance from home, and a chain of Indian kingdoms that were not simple prizes, but living, thinking opponents with their own courage and pride. To meet this world, Alexander did not stand alone. He had his generals, Parmenion, Hephaestion, and others, men who knew how his mind worked and could translate daring ideas into careful plans. He had skilled scouts and local guides, people who knew the river crossings, the timing of the monsoon, the lay of the land. He had engineers who could build boats and bridges, finding ways across waters that seemed at first impassable. He also found in this new region thinkers and wise men whose presence touched another part of him. Stories tell of his interest in Indian sages, gymnosophists, who lived simply and spoke of life, death, and the soul in ways that echoed some of the deeper questions he secretly carried. These were his quieter allies, not on the battlefield, but in the realm of thought. While his soldiers sharpened swords and checked armour, while elephants were being prepared for war on the other side of a river, Alexander sometimes sought conversations with people whose power came not from armies, but from insight. Their calm and the vastness of the land he was entering added another layer to his journey. Not only a march of conquest, but a slow meeting between different ways of understanding the world. The confrontation with Porus at the Hydaspes became the great turning point of his Indian venture. The river itself was swollen, its current strong. To cross, Alexander used trickery and patience, making feints and noise in one place, while secretly moving troops across at another. When the battle finally joined, the scene was intense, but if we soften the edges for this late hour, we can see it as a strange, almost dreamlike meeting. Macedonian phalanxes with their long spears pressing forward through mud and rain, cavalry swirling at the edges, and above all, elephants moving through the field like living fortresses. Horses panicked, men tried to hold their lines as the ground shook under the elephants' steps. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air full of shouts, metal, and the low rumbling cries of the animals. It was not a simple, clean victory. Both sides suffered. But in the end, Alexander's tactics and the discipline of his troops gave him the upper hand. Porus was captured, wounded, but unbroken. When Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated, the Indian king answered with quiet dignity, "Like a king." The Macedonian, impressed, granted him not only his kingdom, but more land. In that moment, a conqueror showing respect to a defeated but proud ruler, the clash of worlds softened slightly into a mutual recognition, like two bright stars reflecting in the same dark river. Even after this victory, the road east did not open up as smoothly as Alexander had dreamed. When his army reached the banks of another great river, the Hyphasis, which we call the Bees, he looked towards the deeper heart of India and imagined more campaigns, more cities, more names to add to his long list of conquests. But his men had reached their limit. rain, heat, illnesses, and the long string of battles had worn their spirits thin. They heard tales of even larger armies waiting further east, of endless plains and mighty rivers still to come. In their hearts, many of them carried a quiet wish, now very different from their kings, not to see the ocean at the edge of the world, but to see the hills of Macedon again, the faces of their families, the graves of their fathers. At Hyphasis, they refused to go any farther. It was a soft but firm line, drawn not on a map, but in human endurance. Alexander, for all his power, had to bow to this reality. He shut himself in his tent for a time, struggling with disappointment, anger, and perhaps the painful recognition that there is always a boundary where even the strongest will meet the simple truth of tired hearts and bodies. The return journey was harsh in its own way, marching back through difficult lands, crossing deserts where many died of thirst, watching the empire he had stretched begin to strain at the edges. Alexander himself would die not long after, in Babylon, at a young age. His great empire was soon divided among his generals, like a precious vessel cracked into pieces. Yet the impact of his brief touch on India did not vanish. In the northwest, Greek-Indian kingdoms later appeared, blending Hellenistic and Indian art and thought. Coins showed foreign kings in Indian style. Sculptures began to depict the Buddha, with folds of drapery and calm faces influenced by Greek models. Trade routes linking the Mediterranean world and India grew more active, carrying not only goods but also stories, techniques and ideas. Indian thinkers heard about distant lands. Greek writers described the strange richness of India. The encounter at the frontier had planted seeds of connection that would continue to grow quietly long after the clatter of armour and the shouting on battlefields had faded into the background of time. Tonight, if you picture that faraway scene, you might see not the violence of battle, but something softer, the wide, dark surface of the Hydaspes River after the fighting has ended, the rain easing into a fine mist, the shapes of elephants and horses standing still at the water's edge, steam rising from their bodies in the cool air. On one bank, Macedonian soldiers sit in weary silence, cleaning their weapons, thinking of home. On the other, Indian warriors tend to their wounded, their thoughts heavy but steady. Above them, the clouds slowly part and a few stars appear, reflected in the restless river. For a brief moment, the land at the edge of India and the world beyond it share the same quiet sky, holding within it the memory of a young king's dream to reach the ends of the earth, and the deeper truth that every journey, no matter how bold, must one day pause and rest. Tonight, you are listening to Part 7, and this part is about the Delhi Sultanate, the line of Muslim sultans who turned the city of Delhi into a bridge between two great worlds, the Indian and the Islamic. Long after the Buddha walked the dusty roads of the Ganges plain, and long after Gupta poets watched the stars over calm cities, the map of northern India changed again. New riders came down from the northwest, through passes in the mountains where cold winds blew and narrow paths wound between sharp rocks. They came from lands that had already been changed by Islam, from Central Asia, Afghanistan and beyond, carrying with them not only sharp swords and strong horses, but also a new language on their lips when they prayed, a new script in their books, and new ideas about law, art and faith. At first, they arrived as raiders, taking wealth from temples and towns, testing the strength of the old Indian kingdoms. But over time, something different began to happen. Instead of returning home with their treasures, some of these conquerors stayed. They chose Delhi, already an old, important place, as their centre, and from there they began to build something that would last for centuries, a sultanate, a Muslim-ruled kingdom in the heart of India. Inside the hearts of those early sultans was a strong desire that went beyond simple looting or passing glory. Men like Qutb al-Din Aybak, Iltutmish, and later Alauddin Khalji and the Tughlaqs wanted to be more than successful generals. They wanted to be remembered as true rulers, people who took a wild, uncertain land and turned it into a functioning, organized realm. They dreamed of a Delhi that would shine like other great cities of the Islamic world, like Baghdad or Samarkand, with mosques, madrasas, markets, and palaces. They wanted to build high towers that reached towards the sky and strong walls that would keep enemies out. They also had a quieter wish to prove to themselves and to others that they were not just foreigners passing through, but rightful kings whose rule had weight, law, and a kind of divine approval. For many of them, the Sultanate was more than a piece of land. It was a chance to root their names deep into the soil of history, to say, we were here, and we shaped this place. But ruling such a land brought many inner struggles. These sultans often felt pulled in different directions at the same time. On one side, there was the world they had come from, their memories of Central Asian courts, their respect for Islamic law, their loyalty to distant traditions and caliphs. On the other side was the living reality of India, a huge, diverse population of mostly non-Muslim subjects, with ancient customs, temples, and caste structures that went back longer than anyone could clearly remember. A sultan might sit on his throne in Delhi and hear, in the same day, a legal scholar advising strict rules based on religion, a tax official complaining about revenue, a local Hindu chief asking for respect for an old temple, and a poet reciting verses in Persian about love and fate. Inside, the ruler had to decide. Should he be harsh or flexible, distant or accessible, a pure defender of one tradition or a careful weaver of many? Some chose stricter paths, trying to enforce their own cultural norms strongly. Others learned to bend and adapt, allowing old practices to continue under new banners. In that quiet space between what they believed and what they faced, many of them must have felt the weight of every choice pressing on their chest at night when the court had fallen silent. Outside the red sandstone walls and carved gates of Delhi, the world remained restless and often dangerous. From the north and west, new waves of invaders and challengers came again and again. Mongols testing the borders, rival Afghan and Turkic leaders hoping to take the throne for themselves. Within India, powerful Hindu kingdoms like the Rajputs in Rajasthan and later the rulers of the south watched Delhi with wary eyes, sometimes fighting, sometimes making alliances. The land itself could also turn against the Sultanate. Failed monsoons could bring drought, hunger, and angry farmers. Too much rain could flood the fields and cut roads. Bandits could attack caravans, cutting the veins of trade that kept cities alive. Delhi sat like a bright lamp in a windy hall, always in need of protection from the gusts of war, rebellion, and nature. The sultans could build forts and train armies, but they could never rest completely. The threat of being knocked from the throne was always there, like a shadow at the edge of the light. To hold their realm together, the Delhi sultans leaned heavily on allies of many kinds. They relied on experienced generals and soldiers, Turks, Afghans, and later also local Indians, who knew how to fight on the plains, how to hold a line of cavalry, how to defend a fort under siege. They depended on administrators who could count, record, and tax, turning harvests into coin and coin into pay for the army. They called on scholars of Islamic law to give their rules a moral and religious frame, and they also quietly used local Brahmin officials, merchants, and village leaders who understood the old rhythms of Indian rural life. Craftsmen and builders were their partners too, shaping mosques with pointed arches and stone screens carved like lace, raising towers like the Qutub Minar that still stands, its lines and inscriptions reaching up into the sky. Poets, musicians, and Sufi saints became another kind of ally, softening the edges of power by bringing comfort and wonder to the people, singing of God's love in ways that cross the simple lines between religions. All of these human threads woven together helped the Sultanate hold for as long as it did. Within this long story, there were many moments of sharp tension and dramatic turning. You could think, for example, of Alauddin Khalji's harsh but effective reforms, fixing prices in markets, trying to control nobles so they could not grow strong enough to rebel, tightening the tax system to keep the army funded. His rule was strict, even frightening to many, but it kept the Mongols at bay and made Delhi feel, for a time, like a solid stone in a river of danger. Later, under Muhammad bin Tughlaq, we see a different kind of turning point, one filled with bold ideas that were too big and too fast for the world around him. He tried to move the capital from Delhi to a far-off city, Dawlatabad, and ordered many people to move with him. He experimented with new coins made of cheap metal, hoping to use the force of law to give them value. These plans, in theory, were clever and forward-looking, but in practice they caused confusion, suffering, and loss of trust. It was as if the Sultan's inner desire to control and remake his realm outpaced the quiet capacity of his people and his own administration. The results cracked the strength of the Sultanate, like hairline fractures spreading through stone after an earthquake. Over time, these cracks widened. Local governors felt more independent. Rival dynasties rose in different parts of India. In the Deccan, new sultanates appeared, shaping their own paths. In the south, powerful Hindu kingdoms like Vijayanagara stood proudly, holding their own. The Delhi Sultanate did not simply fall in a single night. It thinned, weakened, and lost pieces of itself bit by bit. Yet, even as its political control shrank, the deeper traces it left behind did not fade so easily. Persian and Arabic words had begun to mix with local languages, helping shape what would later become Urdu and influencing Hindi and Bengali. Architectural styles that grew in this period, arched doorways, domes, carved stone screens, would later flow into the great Mughal buildings that people still travel across the world to see. Sufi shrines, with their songs and simple gatherings, became quiet centres where people of different faiths could stand side by side, asking for blessings, sharing griefs and hopes. Delhi itself, through fire, rebuilding and change, kept its role as a heart of power and culture. As you lie quiet now, you might imagine walking through Old Delhi at the end of a long day during the Sultanate's time. The heat is softened and a faint breeze moves through narrow lanes. From one side, you hear the call to prayer drifting from a mosque, its sound gentle, rising and falling like a slow wave. From another side, in a courtyard behind a wall, you hear the soft ring of temple bells and a low chant. In the market, lamps are being lit one by one, small flames catching on cotton wicks, turning the street into a line of flickering stars at ground level. Traders talk in a mix of languages, words from different worlds rubbing against each other and somehow fitting. Above the roofs, the dark shape of a tall minaret stands against the sky, its stone surface cooled by the night air, its carvings whispering verses written in a script that came from far away. And all around, hidden in houses and huts, people lie down to sleep. Hindu, Muslim, Jain, others, breathing the same air under the same sky, held unknowingly inside a chapter of history where a city tried to be a bridge between distant horizons, strong enough to stand, gentle enough to let different paths cross in its shade. Tonight you are listening to Makesochi Part 8, and this part is about the Mughal Empire, a long, soft song of many faiths and many colours rising from the plains of North India. When the Delhi Sultanate had already begun to crack and fade, and different rulers were pulling at the land like hands tugging at a worn cloth, a new power approached from the northwest once again. This time it was Babur, a man with a mixed heritage of Turkic and Mongol blood, a small kingdom behind him, and big memories of ancestors like Timur and Genghis Khan weighing on his shoulders. He crossed the passes, brought his guns and his cavalry, and at Panipat in 1526 his army broke the forces of the Delhi Sultan. The battle itself was violent and loud, but afterward something quieter began, the slow rooting of a new dynasty that would not just conquer but also build, paint, write and dream in stone, turning North India into the heart of a large, shimmering empire that people would remember as Mughal. At first, Babur only wanted to survive and hold what he had taken. Yet in his diary he wrote not only of war, but of gardens, rivers, and the delicate beauty of the land he now ruled, a first hint that this empire's story would not only be about power, but also about the longing for order, beauty, and harmony. Inside the early Mughal rulers, there lived a familiar desire to be more than passing conquerors. Babur, and later his grandson Akbar, did not want to simply ride in, take cities, and leave rubble behind. They wished to fashion a stable, lasting kingdom, one where the ruler's name would be spoken not only with fear, but with respect. Akbar, who came to the throne young and ruled for many decades, carried this wish with special intensity. He looked out over a land filled with many peoples, Muslims, Hindus, Jains, others, speaking different languages, worshipping in different ways, living under local customs shaped over centuries. His dream, quietly but firmly held, was to create a political and cultural home wide enough for all of them. He wanted an empire where a Rajput warrior could serve at court without feeling ashamed of his gods, where a Muslim scholar could advise the emperor on law, and where the common farmer, no matter his faith, would feel that the taxes he paid were at least somewhat fair and predictable. Beneath the armour and royal robes, his deepest wish was for a kind of earthly balance, an India strong enough to hold together, yet gentle enough to breathe in many rhythms at once. But this wish did not erase the inner struggles that came with such a task. Akbar was born a Muslim king in a time when many around him saw religious identity as a hard line, drawn clearly between us and them. Advisors whispered at his ear, some insisting that a good ruler must enforce one strict path, others urging flexibility. Inside himself, he had to wrestle with pride and doubt. Was he clever enough to design a system that would truly treat different communities fairly? Was he betraying his own faith by listening deeply to the beliefs of others? At times, the pressure to be a strong, unquestioned monarch clashed with his curiosity and his desire to learn. He invited scholars, priests, and holy men of many religions to his court at Fatehpur Sikri to discuss God, the soul, and moral law. These conversations fed his mind, but also stirred unease among those who waited for him to take a simpler, stricter stance. In the quiet of night, after debates had ended and lamps were dimmed, he must have felt the weight of his experiment, trying to rule not by one clear dogma, but by a wider view that tried to honour many forms of truth at once. Outside the palace walls, the world of the Mughals was full of movement and challenge. Old Rajput clans guarded their forts in the hills, proud and unwilling to bow easily. Afghan chiefs remembered their own days of power and watched the new dynasty with sharp suspicion. To the south, Deccan sultanates and local rulers resisted Mughal advances, sometimes yielding, sometimes fighting stubbornly. Beyond India's borders, the Safavids in Persia and the Uzbeks in Central Asia formed their own centres of power, shaping trade routes and alliances. The land itself was vast and demanding. Monsoons could bless or ruin harvests. Floods and droughts could turn a well-planned tax system into a patchwork of shortages and crises. Even as Mughal banners flew over more and more territory, rebellion, famine, and local resistance remained constant possibilities, pushing the empire's rulers to act, to adjust, to respond. No matter how graceful the paintings at court were, outside in the fields and markets, the daily grind, the fear of hunger, and the memory of old loyalties never disappeared. To hold such a world together, the Mughals leaned on many kinds of allies. They drew Rajput warriors into their service, not only as enemies to be crushed, but as partners who could share power in exchange for honour and respect. They relied on skilled administrators, many from long-standing Indian families, who knew how to measure land, calculate harvests, and collect taxes without tearing villages apart. Artists and craftsmen became quiet pillars of the empire. Miniaturist painters highlighted scenes from court and epics in delicate colours, blending Persian styles with Indian themes. Architects raised palaces, mosques and tombs in red sandstone and white marble, using domes, arches and gardens to shape spaces where power and peace could sit side by side. Poets wrote in Persian, later also in languages closer to the people, turning courtly life, love and loss into soft lines that outlasted the rulers themselves. Mystics, Sufis in particular, offered another kind of support, with shrines where ordinary people came to sing, pray and weep, feeling a gentler face of Islam that spoke not of conquest but of divine love. All these allies, seen and unseen, helped the empire become more than a strict machine of war. Within this broad Mughal story, there were sharp peaks of drama that changed its course. Akbar's religious policies, his decision to reduce the jizya tax on non-Muslims, his willingness to marry Rajput princesses, and his experiments in the court of divine faith were turning points that set his empire on a path of relative tolerance during his lifetime. Later, under Shah Jahan, the empire's wealth and artistic power seemed to reach a delicate high point. The Taj Mahal rose by the Yamuna River, its white marble glowing softly at dawn and dusk, a tomb, a poem in stone, and a symbol of how deeply personal love and imperial power could intertwine. But under Aurangzeb, the tone began to change. His stricter religious views, long wars in the Deccan, and heavier burdens on the people strained the delicate fabric that Akbar had woven. The rise of Maratha resistance, the revival of regional powers, and the slow hardening of religious lines all marked the empire's quiet tilt from a balanced peak toward an unsettled slope. These were the moments when the inner wish for harmony struggled against the old forces of fear, suspicion, and the urge to control. As the years went on, the Mughal Empire, like many great trees, began to hollow from within, even while it still stood tall to the eye. Local governors kept more revenue for themselves, declaring near independence in all but name. European trading companies, especially the British East India Company, dug their roots deeper into Indian ports and politics, at first as polite traders, then as armed powers with their own ambitions. Peasants in some regions felt the weight of taxes, armies, and war more heavily. their lives squeezed between competing rulers. At court, later emperors often lacked the energy, will, or good fortune of their ancestors. Yet, even as political power crumbled and Delhi was shaken by invasions, the deeper Mughal legacy did not simply vanish. The languages they nourished, the buildings they left, the styles of dress, music, and courtesy they shaped, all continued to live in the daily habits and dreams of North India. If you let your mind drift now, you might picture a Mughal garden at twilight, perhaps in Agra or Lahore. Long pools of still water reflect the sky, broken only by the soft ripple of a passing breeze. Cypress trees stand in neat lines, their dark shapes framing pathways of pale stone. Somewhere in a pavilion, a musician plucks at strings, the notes slow and melancholy, floating into the warm air. A call to prayer rises from a nearby mosque, blending in the distance with the faint ring of temple bells from across the river. A scribe sits cross-legged under a lamp, his brush moving carefully across paper, finishing a line of poetry that compares the night sky to a vast jeweled cloak. Above all of this, the first stars appear, watching silently as empires rise and fall beneath them. The Mughal world, with all its contradictions, its wars and its beauty, its heavy taxes and its gentle art, its strict rulers and its mystic saints, lives on in that soft, lingering glow, like perfume in the air, long after the wearer has walked away. Tonight you are listening to Part 9, and this part is about the Taj Mahal, a quiet marble whisper of love and loss by the slow river in Mughal India. By the time this story begins, the Mughal Empire has already grown deep roots along the plains of North India. The courts are rich with silk and jewels, the gardens are laid out in straight lines and cool pools, and the air around the palaces is full of music, poetry, and the soft murmur of many languages. In this world of power and beauty, there lives a prince who will become a king, Shah Jahan. As a young man, he walks through red sandstone halls, rides under high archways, and looks out over the Yamuna River as it glides past Agra. He has been raised among emperors and warriors, but he is also a man of delicate taste, drawn to graceful lines and fine craftsmanship. His life seems woven from strength and elegance, but at the centre of his heart there is one bright thread that will shape his story more than armies or politics: his love for a woman named Mumtaz Mahal. She is not only his wife, but his companion of the mind and spirit, a person whose presence makes the heavy weight of rule feel lighter, whose absence one day will make the whole world feel hollow. Inside Shah Jahan, the desire that grows strongest is not only to be known as a powerful emperor, but to make his love and his sorrow into something that will not fade. When Mumtaz is alive, he wants to keep her close, to share decisions, to hear her voice in the quiet between court sessions. She travels with him, even on campaigns, her tent a small island of warmth and conversation in fields that smell of dust and iron. Later, when she dies in childbirth far from the palace, in a camp by the river, his desire changes shape in an instant. Grief pours into him like dark water. The woman who held his private world together is gone, and no command, no decree, no army can bring her back. Yet the love he feels for her does not disappear with her body. It wanders inside him, restless, seeking a place to rest. He wants to honour her, not with a stone that vanishes under the weather, not with a poem that can be forgotten, but with something that will stand, year after year, century after century, catching the morning light and the moonlight, telling anyone who sees it. There was once a bond between two people so deep that it asked for a form larger than words. But this wish to turn love and grief into a monument does not come without inner struggle. Shah Jahan is a ruler, and rulers must make practical choices. The empire needs money for roads, for forts, for soldiers, for grain in the granaries. To spend years and enormous resources on a tomb might seem, even to himself, like a dangerous indulgence. He also knows that no building, no matter how beautiful, can truly bring comfort equal to what he has lost. There may be nights when he asks himself quietly if he is trying to trap a memory in stone, to hold a feeling that by its nature wants to change and soften with time. Part of him might fear that focusing so much on this single work will draw attention away from other duties, that history might judge him as a king who loved marble more than justice. Another part of him, more tender and stubborn, replies that this is the one grief he cannot simply fold away. In that hidden space inside his chest, the practical emperor and the grieving husband pull against each other, and it is the husband who slowly, insistently wins. Outside the palace, the world of his decision is wide and complex. The empire is still strong, but it has its own troubles, regions that need watching, nobles whose loyalty must be tended, borders that must be guarded against rival powers. The land along the Yamuna must be carefully chosen and prepared, foundations laid so that the heavy weight of marble will not crack the earth. The river itself is both a blessing and a challenge, offering beauty and coolness, but also the risk of floods. Beyond India, trade routes bring fine stone from distant quarries, craftsmen from Central Asia and Persia, patterns and techniques from many places. Any long project can be touched by famine, war, or political change. Years of building mean years of risk. Even nature has its say. The heat of Indian summers, the misty chill of winter mornings, the monsoon rains that can slow work and test the patience of everyone involved. Shah Jahan's vision must pass through all these outer forces, pressing on it like wind on a fragile flame. To make this vision real, he calls on a vast network of allies and skills. Architects and master builders gather, some from within the Mughal heartland, some from lands further west, bringing ideas of domes, arches, and symmetrical gardens. Stone cutters and carvers arrive, capable of turning hard marble into thin screens that look like lace and into flowers that seem soft, though they are solid. Calligraphers prepare verses from the Quran, writing them in elegant black script that will curve above doorways and along walls. Inlay artists learn to set small pieces of coloured stone, carnelian, jasper, onyx, turquoise, into white marble, creating vines, blossoms, and delicate borders. Labourers dig foundations, move heavy blocks, mix mortar, and lift materials with simple but clever machines. For years, perhaps 2 decades or more, this great human hive hums by the river, all its buzzing focused on one central idea: a tomb that feels like a garden in stone, a promise of peace for the dead and a soft wonder for the living. As the work rises, there are many turning points. The first time the main platform is complete and people can walk where a flat field once lay. The moment when the white dome, shaped in careful stages, closes at the top and the building gains its full, rounded form. The day when the 4 slender minarets are finished, standing like quiet guardians at each corner, slightly tilted outward so that, should they ever fall, they will not crush the tomb, they protect. Then comes the more delicate work, the carving of patterns, the setting of inlay, the polishing of marble, until it responds to light like calm water. Gardens are laid out, with paths and channels that bring the reflection of the building down to the ground, so that a visitor sees the monument and its mirroring image together, as if the world above and the world below were both gently holding this symbol of love and loss. When Mumtaz's body is placed within, and later Shah Jahan's own body is laid beside her. The long process reaches its quiet summit. The building has taken its breath and now stands, complete, by the river's side. The result is not loud. The Taj Mahal does not shout. It does not show scenes of battle or power. Instead, it whispers. Its curves and lines are so balanced that the eye feels a kind of rest just by looking. In the early morning, when mist rises from the river and the first pale light touches the marble, the whole structure glows softly, almost as if it were made of light instead of stone. At midday, it is sharp and white against a bright sky, clear and sure of itself. At sunset, it turns warm, taking on shades of pink and gold. At night, Tonight you are listening to Part 10, and this part is about the Battle of Plassey, the quiet but world-shaping moment when the winds over India changed direction, almost without anyone realising how deeply the future had shifted. By the middle of the 1700s, the Mughal Empire had grown soft at its edges. Its great domes still caught the mounting sun. Its palaces still echoed with music and poetry. But its authority had thinned like old silk. Local rulers, Nawabs, Rajas, chiefs, held more power than the emperor in Delhi. Among them was the young Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, whose territory was so rich that people said, if you shake the soil of Bengal, gold dust will fall. And traders from across the world came to its river ports, Armenians, Persians, Chinese, and increasingly Europeans. The British East India Company, which began as a group of merchants looking for spices and cloth, had built warehouses and forts along the rivers, and was slowly learning how to turn trade into influence and influence into quiet control. Inside Siraj-ud-Dawla himself, there lived a very human desire. He wanted to be respected as a true ruler, not pushed aside by older nobles or intimidated by foreign traders with their cannons and careful smiles. He wished to protect Bengal's wealth, which had been nurtured by generations of farmers, weavers and merchants. He wanted his name to carry trust among his allies and caution among his enemies. He was young, impulsive, proud, sometimes too proud, and he feared the shadow of foreign companies growing across his land. His wish was simple but heavy, to keep Bengal's independence strong in a time when the world around him was filled with shifting alliances, whispers of betrayal, and the growing reach of European ambition. Inside him, courage and worry lived side by side, each whispering different advice. But he faced inner struggles that many young rulers face. Siraj had enemies, not only outside his kingdom, but inside his own court. Wealthy nobles who disliked his temper, generals who felt overlooked, and merchants who feared losing their privileges if the Nawab acted too boldly. He also struggled with his own impulses. At times he acted without patience, punishing harshly when he felt betrayed and missing opportunities to build steady friendships. This mixture of youth, pride, and fear made his throne feel unstable beneath him. He wanted to defend his land, but he did not fully trust the people he depended on. At night, in the quiet of the palace with lamps flickering low, he must have felt that loneliness known to many rulers, the fear that those who bow in public might be sharpening knives in private. Outside Bengal, global forces were moving like slow, powerful tides. In Europe, wars between Britain and France spilled across oceans. Their ships fought not only on the seas, but through trade posts and alliances in India. The French supported certain Indian rulers. The British supported others. In Bengal, the British company had fortified its trading base at Calcutta, worrying the Nawab. When he demanded they stop and they refused, tensions rose. Siraj marched on Calcutta and captured it, believing he had made a bold stand. But he did not know that far away in Madras, a British officer named Robert Clive, ambitious, clever and restless, was preparing to strike back. Clive sailed north with soldiers, sepoys, and the quiet confidence of a man who believed destiny favoured him. The stage was being set not just for a battle, but for a change in the very shape of India's future. Clive did not walk alone. He had allies inside Bengal whom Siraj trusted, merchants like Jagat Seths, landholders and generals such as Mir Jafar resented the Nawab's rule for different reasons: fear of losing influence, hope of gaining more power, and anger at his unpredictable decisions. Clive reached out to them with letters, promises and gold. He played a dangerous, delicate game of negotiation and manipulation, weaving a silent web around the Nawab's court. The British Company's soldiers might face Bengal's army on the field, but the real war was already happening in secret, a war of promises, doubts, and betrayals whispered behind closed doors. Meanwhile, monsoon clouds gathered in the sky. The river swelled, and the air grew heavy with heat. The outside world, rain, river, foreign trade, European rivalry, all pressed in on Bengal, creating a storm that was not only weather, but history itself moving toward a turning point. June 23rd, 1757, Plassey. The field near the Bhagirathi River was muddy from rain. Mango trees stood in long rows, casting heavy shade. On one side stood the Nawab's large army. Infantry, cavalry, artillery, and elephants adorned for war. On the other side, Clive's smaller force, European soldiers and Indian sepoys, their cannons well placed, their strategy tight, but the most important element on the battlefield was not weapons or courage, it was uncertainty. Mir Jafar, commander of a large portion of the Nawab's forces, had secretly agreed to betray Siraj and not fight unless the battle already seemed lost. Other nobles were watching him, uncertain of whether to support the Nawab or save themselves. When the fighting began, the British cannons fired steadily, scattering Siraj's troops, while the Nawab's artillery, hindered by rain-soaked powder, struggled to respond. Confusion spread. Messages moved back and forth. Mir Jafar held his troops still. The Nawab waited for a support that never came. In that long, slow collapse of loyalty, the battle's outcome took shape, not as a roaring conclusion, but as a quiet unravelling. When Siraj-ud-Dawla realised that betrayal had hollowed out his army from within, he fled the field. His defeat was not thunderous, but sad, like a lamp guttering in the wind. Clive took control of Bengal through Mir Jafar, who was crowned as a puppet ruler. The British East India Company, a group of merchants who had once come simply for cloth and spices, suddenly found themselves holding the key to one of the wealthiest regions on earth. The shift was quiet but immense. From this victory, the company gained revenue, influence, and confidence. Bengal's riches fed its armies, its ambitions, and later its conquest of even larger territories. This single day became the doorway through which British rule in India entered, step by step, for almost 200 years. The Nawab's end came soon. Betrayed, hunted, he was captured and killed while trying to escape. He was young, too young, and his dreams were swallowed by the tide of events that moved faster than he could contain. The men who betrayed him gained short-lived rewards, but history remembers them with a shadow across their names. The company grew, its officers wealthier than kings, its soldiers more confident, its grip firmer. India's political landscape slowly bent toward a new direction, one shaped not by Mughal emperors or regional Nawabs, but by foreign traders who now ruled through ledgers, muskets and alliances sealed with ink rather than blood. Tonight, if you imagine that battlefield long after the noise has died, you might see only the mango trees standing silently under a grey sky. The ground is wet, the air still heavy with the smell of rain. A few birds hop through the leaves, searching for insects in the quiet soil. The river moves steadily in the distance, carrying no sign of the day that changed so much. The field looks calm now, almost peaceful, giving no hint that in this very place the thread of India's history gently turned like a leaf changing direction in a slow, unseen wind, setting the course for centuries that would follow. Tonight you are listening to Hats Part 11, and this part is about the East India Company, the quiet transformation of a trading house into a hidden empire that wrapped its fingers around India's wealth. After the Battle of Plassey, the field grew still, the mud dried, and the mango trees went back to casting ordinary shade. But in offices and forts along the rivers of Bengal, something new was beginning to take shape. The British East India Company, which had once been only a merchant guest in India, now sat in the chair of a ruler, even if it still pretended to be just a business. Clerks sharpened quills, opened ledgers, and wrote numbers in neat lines, the taxes collected from villagers, the cost of maintaining soldiers, the profits from silk and cotton. For the first time, the company did not just buy from Indian merchants, it controlled the very land that produced the goods. Bengal, with its rich fields and busy looms, became a kind of beating heart for the company's ambitions, pumping wealth across the sea to a distant island where most of its subjects would never walk. On the surface, the world looked almost the same. Farmers still sowed seeds, weavers still sat at their looms, boats still floated down the river, but beneath, the relationship between India and the men in the counting houses had quietly changed. Inside the minds of the company's leaders, there was a powerful desire that grew stronger with each ship that sailed home heavy with goods. They wanted security for their trade, steady flows of revenue, and a sense of control that would keep out rivals, especially the French. Men like Robert Clive did not only dream of full warehouses, they dreamed of influence in London's halls of power, of titles and estates bought with Indian money. The directors in London wanted returns for their shareholders, dividends that would make investors smile, and politicians supportive. They were merchants, but they began to feel like distant kings, making decisions that would affect millions of people they would never meet. Their wish was to make profit predictable, to turn the uncertain world of trade, subject to storms, wars, and shifting alliances, into something as regular and controlled as the lines in their ledgers. In their private thoughts, many of them believed that they were bringing order and improvement to a land they saw through their own limited eyes, even as the rules they made placed heavy burdens on the people who worked the soil and spun the thread. Yet inside many of these men, there were also quiet conflicts. Some company officials arrived in India young and hopeful, imagining adventure and honour, but found themselves drawn into a world of bribes, side deals, and moral fog. They had to decide whether to close their eyes to corruption or to join it. A few felt genuine affection for the land, learned Indian languages, grew fond of the rivers and monsoon rains, and wondered if their presence was truly helping or slowly hurting the country that fed them. Others felt only distance and superiority, treating India as a place to be squeezed before returning home to a comfortable life. Even for those who believed they were doing good, there must have been moments, standing on a veranda at dusk, looking out over a village where the people were thin and tired, when a small inner voice asked whether this system of company rule was balanced or deeply unfair. Between personal ambition, loyalty to the shareholders, and the human reality around them, their souls were sometimes pulled in three directions at once. Outside the walls of Calcutta's fort and the company's offices, the forces shaping India were large and restless. Old Mughal authority had faded, leaving a patchwork of regional powers that could be stirred, bribed, or attacked. The French East India Company still fought for influence in some areas, making the British nervous. The global market for Indian textiles, especially fine muslins and calicos, was strong, but also threatened by growing textile industries in Britain itself, powered by spinning machines and steam. Monsoons still governed harvests. A bad season could mean hunger and unrest, which in turn could shake tax collections and trade. In the countryside, villagers did not always understand who ruled them now, a Nawab with limited power, a distant emperor, or this strange company whose agents appeared with demands written in a foreign language. Bandits, local rebels, and rival chiefs moved in the gaps of this confusion. The company's neat plans, made in cool rooms, had to survive all these rough winds: the weather, the markets, the old loyalties, and the human need for dignity and survival. To strengthen its hold, the company relied on a growing network of allies and tools. It hired Indian soldiers, sepoys, who drilled with muskets and marched in ranks following European patterns. It worked with bankers and money lenders who advanced cash to pay troops and collect taxes, turning finance into another thread of control. It used local zamindars, landholders, as intermediaries, making them responsible for collecting revenue from villagers in exchange for a share and legal recognition. Lawyers, surveyors, and scribes helped measure fields, write contracts, and build a new machinery of rule that mixed old Indian structures with British ideas of property and law. In London, Parliament and the Crown, once distant, began to pay closer attention, sending regulations and oversight after scandals reached their ears, like the shocking stories of nabobs, company officials returning home with sudden, enormous wealth. Even reformers who criticised the worst abuses often still accepted the basic idea that British power in India should remain. The company's world was held up by many hands: soldiers, clerks, financiers, landlords, some enthusiastic, some reluctant, some simply trying to survive. There were key turning points in this slow transformation from trader to ruler. In 1765, after more conflict and negotiation, the Mughal emperor, now weak and dependent, granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, the official right to collect revenue in his name. This was like giving a merchant the keys to the treasury. The company tried a strange dual government, leaving Indian officials as a visible layer, while it quietly controlled the flow of money behind them. For ordinary people, this meant that responsibility was unclear, but the tax demands were very real. In the early 1770s, a terrible famine swept through Bengal. Failed monsoons, high revenue demands, and mismanagement combined into a disaster that killed many, many people. Fields lay empty, roads saw wandering, starving figures, and villages shrank into silence. The company still insisted on collecting revenue, even as grain grew scarce. In London, the news of this tragedy and of financial crises within the company led to debates, inquiries, and eventually the Regulating Act, and later the India Act, laws that allowed the British state to supervise the company more closely. Step by step, the line between a private corporation and a political power blurred. For the Indian weaver, farmer, or small merchant, these changes were not felt as tidy acts or policies, but as the texture of daily life roughening. Weavers, once able to sell their cloth in open markets, often found themselves pushed into unfair contracts, forced to sell only to company agents at low prices while still paying high for food and materials. Farmers faced revenue demands that did not soften much, even when harvests were poor. Some groups did benefit. Certain zamindars, merchants and soldiers, gained status and wealth by working with the new masters, but many felt a growing sense of helplessness as decisions that shaped their lives were made far away, in Calcutta boardrooms, in London committee rooms, by men who would never walk their fields or sit in their crowded huts. That feeling that the strings were held by invisible hands was one of the company's quietest but deepest legacies. Tonight, if you imagine the scene not on a battlefield but in a company office in Calcutta at the close of day, you might see a long room with high ceilings and shuttered windows. The air is warm but beginning to cool. A clerk in simple clothes sits at a wooden desk finishing the day's entries by the light of an oil lamp. Columns of numbers, lists of villages, amounts of rice, cloth and coin. Outside on the river, boats drift slowly, their lanterns bobbing like small stars on dark water. Somewhere upstream, a village goes to sleep after a hard day in the fields, not knowing that its taxes, noted in ink in this dim room, will help decide the fate of lands far beyond the horizon. The clerk closes the ledger. Sand is sprinkled to dry the ink, and the book is shut with a soft sound. In that small, gentle closing, a chapter of India's story is being written, not with trumpets or drums, but with quiet scratches of a pen and the steady turning of pages as a trading company's shadow slowly lengthens over an entire subcontinent. Tonight you are listening to Part 12 Fours, and this part is about the quiet world of Indian hands, clothes, tools and buildings, and how they slowly shaped the way people lived, worked and dreamed. If you look back over all the centuries we have already walked through, Indus towns, Ashoka's pillars, Gupta courts, the Delhi sultans, Mughal gardens, the coming of the company, you will notice something gentle but constant. People are always making things. Even when empires rise and fall, a weaver still sits at his loom, a potter still turns his wheel, a mason still lifts his chisel. The kings and battles leave big marks in the storyteller's books. But the everyday world that most people touch with their fingers is made of cloth, tools, and walls. In India, this material world has always been full of colour, pattern, and patient craft, like a huge soft quilt sewn by many generations, each stitching their own small piece. Inside the people of this land, there has long been a deep desire to turn simple needs into quiet beauty. A farmer needs something to wear in the heat, so he wraps cotton around himself, but then adds a border of colour, a small pattern, a careful pleat. A woman needs a pot to carry water, so she buys or shapes a clay vessel, but then smooths it, burns it to a rich red, maybe adds a line or a symbol with her thumb. A carpenter needs a door to close a house, but he carves small flowers into it rather than leaving it plain. Across villages and cities, the wish is the same, not only to survive, but to make life feel a little more graceful and dignified. Clothes are not just clothes, they become identity. Tools are not just tools, they become proof of skill. Houses are not just shelters, they become small worlds with their own order and soul. This desire, soft and quiet, pushes hands to work a little longer, eyes to notice a little more, so that the ordinary can become quietly special. Yet this wish to create beauty and usefulness lives side by side within a struggle. For many craftsmen and workers, life is hard and money is thin. A weaver may dream of starting a piece with the finest thread and the richest dyes, but his family needs food and his buyer demands a lower price. A mason might want to spend extra days smoothing a stone, but the overseer is impatient and the pay is fixed. A poor mother might wish to dress her child in bright fabric for a festival, but on most days there is only one old, faded set of clothes. Inside many Indian hearts there's a gentle tug of war between the need to work fast and cheap and the longing to add that little extra touch that makes something truly beautiful. Sometimes the pressure wins and the work becomes rough and rushed. Sometimes the longing wins and a small wonder appears in a corner of a courtyard, in a patterned shawl, in a carved window frame that most people will pass without really seeing. For the maker, those small victories are like secret lights that keep the spirit from becoming completely tired. Outside the inner world of these makers, the land and the times shape what they create. India's heat and monsoons ask for clothes that breathe and dry quickly. So for thousands of years people have worn cotton. Thin dhotis and saris, lungis and turbans, wrapped in many styles from state to state. In colder hills, people weave thicker shawls and coats from wool. The tools they use are shaped by their crops and animals. Ploughs pulled by bullocks, sickles curved to cut rice and wheat, grinding stones that turn grain into flour. In the north, high mountains and long rivers provide stone and water, so towns rise that use both. In the south, black stone and laterite shape temples and houses. Foreign influences drift in too. Central Asian horse gear, Persian carpets, Portuguese guns, British steel rails. Each new wave brings different materials and designs, pressing the old ways to bend or break. The outside world does not simply watch. It pushes, pulls, and sometimes tears at the fabric of Indian craft. To answer these pressures, Indian material culture has always relied on a wide family of allies, the guilds of weavers and goldsmiths, potters and carpenters, masons and metal workers who share skills from parent to child, master to apprentice. In some towns, certain streets belong to certain crafts, one lane full of dye pits, another lined with looms, another echoing with the ring of hammer on metal. Religious centres also become quiet helpers. Temples, mosques, and later churches and gurdwaras order cloth, lamps, metalwork, and stone carvings, giving artisans steady work, and in return craftsmen pour their best effort into sacred spaces. Learning, too, plays a role. Somewhere in a small workshop, an old man teaches a young boy how to twist thread, how to hold a chisel, how to judge the thickness of a wooden beam by sound when you tap it. These relationships between craftsmen, holy places, and shared knowledge are like invisible beams, holding up the visible world of objects and buildings. Over time, certain moments become turning points in this long story of hands and tools. The coming of the Mughals brought new forms of dress to the courts, jamas, long flowing robes, rich turbans, and new architectural ideas, gardens laid out in four-part patterns, high arches, domes, pietra dura inlay. Indian craftsmen did not simply copy these. They blended them with older styles so that red sandstone and white marble, Hindu and Persian motifs began to live together on the same walls and in the same textiles. Later, the spread of the East India Company and British power brought another change. European-style jackets, trousers and boots appeared first on soldiers and officials, then slowly influenced urban fashion. New tools and machines arrived. Printing presses, metal ploughs, railways, textile mills. In some places, handloom weavers found their cloth competing with cheap machine-made imports from British factories. Fine muslins that once took months of careful spinning and weaving suddenly had fewer buyers. For many artisans, this felt like the ground shifting under their feet, a gentle but painful breaking of an old way of life. The results of these changes were mixed. In some areas, traditional crafts were weakened, and entire communities of weavers or metal workers had to change their work, becoming labourers, farmers, or factory workers. In other places, crafts adapted. They took on new patterns, used new tools, or focused on fine work that machines could not easily replace. Cities grew, and with them came new building styles. Bungalows with sloping roofs and verandas, grand Indo-Saracenic structures mixing Indian and European motifs, railway stations that looked like curious hybrids of palace and machine hall. In daily dress, people learned to switch between worlds, wearing Indian garments at home and sometimes Western-style clothes in offices or schools. The material life of India became layered, old and new, local and foreign, simple village tools and modern factory machines all existing side by side, like different voices in a single complex song. Tonight, if you let your mind drift over this landscape of things, you might picture a small Indian town at dusk, somewhere in the 1800s. In one house, a weaver's loom creaks softly as he finishes a length of cloth. The pattern's simple, but the edges carefully tightened by hand. Next door, a carpenter smooths the frame of a wooden door, pausing to carve a tiny flower into one corner, something only he and perhaps the family will ever really notice. Down the lane, a mason leans against a wall he helped build years ago, watching a train's faint whistle in the distance as iron wheels roll over new-laid tracks. Above him, the outlines of an old temple and a new clock tower both touch the darkening sky. Children run past in a mix of clothes, one in a crisp shirt and shorts, another in a loose kurta, another wrapped in a small sari. As the light fades, lamps are lit inside clay houses, in brick buildings, and behind carved stone screens. From far away, they might look like simple points of light. But if you stand close, you can see that each lamp rests in a world carefully made by human hands, wrapped in fabric, held by tools, sheltered by walls, each one a tiny, shining proof that even in times of change and pressure, the quiet art of living with care has never fully gone out. Tonight you are listening to Part 13, and this part is about the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, that first great uneven cry against the company's rule, born from many small hurts and one sharp spark. By the middle of the 19th century, the East India Company's shadow lay across large parts of India. Its soldiers marched in neat lines, its officials wrote neat laws, its tax collectors carried neat ledgers. Yet beneath that appearance of order, the land was full of quiet tension. Indian sepoys, local soldiers serving under British officers, wore uniforms, drilled to European commands, and carried muskets paid for by the company. They stood between their own people and the foreign power that now claimed to rule in the name of profit and civilization. Many of them came from communities with long traditions of honour in arms. They had grown up hearing stories of warriors who served kings and defended their homelands. Now, they served a trading company. They wanted steady pay, respect, and a sense that their work had dignity. In their hearts, a simple desire took shape: to be treated as loyal, valued soldiers, not as disposable tools, and to feel that the power they helped enforce was not insulting their beliefs and crushing their people. Inside these sepoys, though, there were difficult struggles. Some took pride in the new uniforms, the drill, the muskets, and the disciplined marches that set them apart from village life. Others felt uneasy, wearing the symbols of a foreign force, answering to officers who often did not know their language, their customs, or their gods. They were torn between loyalty to their paymaster and loyalty to their own traditions and families. A Brahmin sepoy might worry that travelling overseas on a campaign would break religious rules. a Muslim sepoy might fear that new practices around food, clothing, or rituals would pull him away from what he believed was right. They heard rumours that the company wanted to convert them to erase their identities. Some dismissed these stories as campfire talk, others let them take root. Many sepoys had families in villages now strained by taxes, debts, and changing land laws. They looked at the faces of their parents and children during leave and wondered, were they protecting their people by serving the company or helping to tighten the noose around their necks? That question, rarely spoken aloud, grew heavier each year. Beyond their inner doubts, strong external pressures pushed on them from every side. The company had extended its rule through a mix of war and law, annexing kingdoms under policies like the doctrine of lapse, which allowed it to take over states where a ruler died without a natural heir. Important royal houses in places like Jhansi and Awadh saw their sovereignty taken away, their palaces absorbed into a system of administration that felt like polite theft. Land settlements changed age-old patterns of ownership and obligation, turning some once secure landlords into debtors and some independent peasants into tenants, struggling under rent and revenue demands. Missionaries arrived under British protection, preaching a new faith and sometimes speaking harshly about the old gods and customs. Newspapers and pamphlets in English and Indian languages carried news of British victories elsewhere in the world, feeding a sense that this foreign power was spreading like an unstoppable tide. To many Indians, princes, soldiers, peasants, and city dwellers alike, the world they knew felt as if it were being quietly dismantled and rebuilt by hands that did not care about the foundations. When the spark finally came, it was small and made of grease and rumour. New rifle cartridges were introduced for the Enfield rifle, and sepoys were told they had to bite them open before loading. Whispers spread through the barracks that the cartridges were greased with the fat of cows and pigs, an insult to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, for whom cows are sacred and pigs unclean. Whether these rumours were fully true or partly fueled by fear, they struck at a deep nerve. For many sepoys, this felt like proof that the company not only disrespected their beliefs, but might be deliberately trying to break them. Some officers tried to reassure them, others brushed away their concerns. In the north, at places like Barrackpore and Meerut, tension tightened like a bowstring. When the sepoy Mangal Pandey attacked his British officers at Barrackpore, his act, though quickly suppressed, was like a drumbeat heard in the distance, a sign that anger inside the ranks had begun to boil. Punishments followed, adding humiliation to fear, and the sense grew among soldiers that they stood at a line that could not be crossed without losing themselves. The rebellion that broke out in 1857 was not the work of a single mind or one clean plan. It was more like a storm that formed from many small winds. In Meerut, when sepoys who refused the cartridges were punished and paraded in chains, their comrades erupted in fury. They fired on British officers and civilians, released the prisoners, and rode for Delhi under a sky that must have felt strangely wide and uncertain. When they entered the old Mughal capital, they called on the aging Emperor Bahadur Shah II, more poet than ruler, to become the symbolic leader of a rising against company rule. In other places, Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi and beyond, different leaders, different groups and different grievances fed into the uprising. Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, a queen whose kingdom had been annexed under the doctrine of lapse, took up arms, riding into battle with her young son strapped to her back, becoming a figure of courage in stories told long after. Nana Sahib at Kanpur, rebels and villagers in Awadh, talukdars, peasants, dispossessed soldiers, each brought their own pain and hope into the fire. At the same time, the rebellion was not all one colour. Some princes and groups chose not to join, fearing that a failed revolt would leave them worse off, or believing that the company, with its disciplined troops and guns, could not be beaten. Some sepoys stayed loyal, or were too uncertain and isolated to act. In many towns, ordinary people were caught between forces they did not control, rebels riding in with slogans of freedom, company troops returning with orders to restore order. There were moments of terrible violence on all sides, civilians killed, old grievances unleashed in sudden cruelty. For those living through it, the year 1857 must have felt like the ground itself was shaking. Villages and cities passing from one hand to another, rumours racing faster than truth, neighbours uncertain of whom to trust. The uprising was at once a revolt against foreign rule, a set of local wars, and a tangle of personal and community vendettas. Its very confusion was part of its nature. Like a fire spreading unevenly through a dry forest, the company, shocked by the scale of the rebellion, responded with fierce determination. Reinforcements came from other parts of India and from overseas. British officers and loyal sepoys marched to retake Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, and other centres of resistance. Sieges dragged on in the heat and dust, with hunger and disease haunting both attackers and defenders. When cities fell back into company hands, punishments were harsh and often indiscriminate. Hangings, executions, villages burned, suspected rebels shot or blown from cannons. British public opinion, stirred by reports of massacres of Europeans, demanded vengeance, and many soldiers answered that call without mercy. In turn, Indian memories of this period held deep scars, stories of relatives killed, homes destroyed, and dignity crushed. The rebellion failed to drive out the British, but it succeeded in showing both sides how much anger and fear lay beneath the surface of company rule. In the quiet that followed, a new chapter began almost at once. The British government in London decided that the company could no longer be trusted with such vast power. In 1858, the Crown took direct control of India, ending company rule and beginning what would be called the British Raj. Official proclamations promised more respect for Indian princes, greater care for religious and social customs, and a more benevolent face of empire. Railways expanded, telegraph lines spread, and new institutions of education and law took deeper root. But the memory of 1857 remained like a buried ember, warm under the ash. For Indians who had taken part or lost loved ones, it was a first great rising, proof that the foreign power could be challenged. For the British, it was a warning that beneath any calm there was the possibility of sudden storm. The new Raj would be built with these memories always present, shaping policies, fears, and the careful watch kept on any sign of unrest. Tonight, if you try to see this year, not as a line in a history book, but as a living evening, you might picture a village in North India, some months after the worst fighting is over. The sun has gone down, and people sit in small circles near their homes. An old man tells a child about soldiers who once marched down this very road, dust rising around their feet, banners stirring in hot wind. A woman, listening, remembers someone who never came back. Somewhere in the distance, a telegraph wire hums faintly in the night air, carrying coded messages between British stations across the land. The fields lie dark and quiet, but under that quiet, the earth holds the footprints of rebels and redcoats, the ashes of burnt houses, the seeds of stories that will be told and retold. Above them all, the sky is wide and deep, the stars patient and silent, as if watching a land that has cried out once and will, in its own time and its own way, learn new ways to speak again. Tonight you are listening to Part 14, and this part is about the British Raj, the long, strange time when India lived under a distant crown, ruled from far away by people who said they brought order, even while many quiet hearts felt a different truth. When the East India Company's rule ended after the Great Uprising of 1857, the British government in London stepped in and wrapped India in a new layer of control. A message was read out in towns and cities in the name of Queen Victoria, promising protection for princes, respect for religions, and a more careful hand on the wheel of power. From that point on, India was no longer officially a merchant's playground. It was called the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. A viceroy now sat where company governors had once sat, dressed in fine uniforms, riding in processions under golden umbrellas, speaking in English while interpreters stood ready to turn his words into local tongues. On walls and coins, the face that mattered most was not an Indian emperor but a monarch, living in a cold island thousands of miles away. The idea was simple in British minds: to rule India firmly but fairly, to keep peace, collect taxes, and use the land's wealth to strengthen an empire that circled the globe. To many people in India, it felt like living in a large house where the landlord was always elsewhere, sending orders through a chain of strangers. Inside the British rulers themselves, there were desires that were not all cruel, but not all gentle either. Many officers and civil servants grew up in Britain reading stories about chivalry and empire, told that their country had a duty to civilize the places it ruled. When they came to India, some truly wanted to bring what they saw as improvements: better roads, cleaner cities, modern courts, schools teaching science and literature. They enjoyed the idea of being just, wise administrators. They wished to be remembered as men who built railways and bridges, stamped out certain brutal customs, and held the peace between many different peoples. At the same time, they also wanted comfort, status, and security. They built clubs where only Europeans could enter, lived in bungalows on cool hills, away from the crowded Indian towns, and often assumed they were naturally superior. Inside, a quiet pride told them they were the rightful leaders, even when they barely spoke local languages or understood the deep history under their feet. That pride mixed with fear of another uprising like 1857, and together they shaped a style of rule that was polite on the surface but hard and unbending underneath. For many Indians, living under the Raj brought its own inner struggles. There were princes who kept their thrones under British protection, invited to grand durbars where they bowed to the viceroy and received medals in front of cheering crowds. They wore jewels, rode elephants, and held festivals, but they knew that the final word over their lands no longer belonged to them. Some felt grateful for the security and ceremony, others felt humiliated, like actors playing kings on a stage built by someone else. There were educated Indians who went to English-style schools, read Shakespeare, learned about democracy and liberty from British books, and yet returned home to find their own people ruled without a real voice. They wanted to use their new knowledge to improve their country, but they were shut out of the highest ranks of the civil service, stopped by race, pay scales, and quiet prejudice. Villagers faced their own confusion. The officer who decided their taxes now had a strange name and pale skin. The laws that governed land and crime came from far-off parliaments they had never seen. Inside many hearts, a slow, painful question grew. How can a people respect themselves fully when the final decisions about their lives are always made by others? Outside these inner feelings, the Raj reshaped India's physical and social landscape in powerful ways. Steel rails were laid across the land, and trains began to run, their whistles cutting through early morning mist on plains and hills. Telegraph wires stretched between cities like thin metal vines, carrying dots and dashes faster than any horse could gallop. New courts, police stations, and district offices appeared, often in heavy stone buildings mixing Indian arches with European columns. Large irrigation canals were dug in some regions, turning dry fields green and feeding new harvests. But there were also new borders on paper, provinces cut and labelled, tribal lands fixed, hill and forest areas brought under stricter rule. The British collected detailed surveys of land, people, and crops, turning living villages into rows of numbers in thick books. To them it felt like knowledge and order. To many Indians, it sometimes felt like being pinned down and measured like specimens in a cabinet. The monsoons still came and went, crops still rose and fell, but now famines and floods were counted and reported to distant officers, and decisions about relief and neglect depended on budgets and policies written in English. The Raj survived not only through British officers, but through many Indian allies whose lives became tied to the new system. There were landlords who learned to navigate British land laws and kept or expanded their estates by cooperating with the government. There were soldiers in the Indian Army who wore British-style uniforms and fought in wars far away, in Africa, in Europe, in West Asia, carrying Indian courage into battles that had nothing to do with their home villages. There were clerks and lawyers trained in English who found jobs in courts and offices, writing petitions, arguing cases, translating between rulers and ruled. Missionaries ran schools and hospitals. Indian reformers used some of the new ideas to challenge old customs like child marriage or rigid caste rules. Even in the world of business, some Indian merchants and industrialists learned to work within the empire's trade networks, building mills and factories. All of them, in different ways, held up corners of the Raj, sometimes willingly, sometimes because there seemed to be no other path. It was a web in which even those who suffered from the system could be caught as small supporting threads. Still, the Raj was marked by painful turning points that showed its deeper hardness. Famines struck several times in different regions, Orissa, Bihar, the Deccan, and elsewhere. Drought would wither crops, and people would walk long distances with empty stomachs looking for food. The British administration, guided by ideas of free markets and fears of encouraging dependency, often hesitated to intervene strongly. Grain might still be exported from a starving area because contracts and prices said it was profitable to do so. Railways that could have carried relief sometimes carried goods for sale instead. Reports were written, commissions formed, but in huts and on roadsides people died quietly, their bodies wrapped quickly and the earth turned over them. In some cities, British racism rose like a wall. Separate spaces, harsh words in clubs and offices, cartoons and comments that treated Indians as children at best, scenes of loyalty, Indian rulers saluting the flag, Indian soldiers marching in British wars, sat next to scenes of contempt and inequality. Each such moment deepened a hidden reservoir of resentment and sorrow in Indian hearts, even as some remained grateful for the safety of trains, the stability of courts, or the opportunity of schools. Over time, the very tools the Raj used to strengthen itself began to create something new and unexpected, a sense of Indian nationhood. English language schools and universities turned out generations of students who could read not only British literature, but also modern political thought. Railways and telegraphs tied distant regions together, making it easier for people in Bengal to know what was happening in Punjab or Bombay. Educated Indians started forming associations, writing newspapers and holding meetings where they discussed not just local grievances but the future of India as a whole. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded, at first a cautious body, full of polite petitions and friendly speeches, asking the British to include more Indians in government and to listen more carefully. Many British officials saw them as harmless, even useful, but in the quiet gathering of these voices, something delicate was forming. The idea that India was not just a collection of princely states and districts, but a single, larger we that could one day ask for more than crumbs of power. The Raj tried to balance reform with control, giving a little, denying much, always afraid that too much freedom would shake the empire. Tonight, if you imagine the Raj not as a map coloured red in a school atlas, but as an evening scene, you might picture a small railway station somewhere in North India around the year 1900. The sky is darkening, and a warm wind blows dust along the tracks. A train pulls in with a low-tired whistle. On the platform stand many kinds of people. A British officer in a stiff hat, a princely messenger in silk, a young Indian lawyer carrying English books, a peasant with a cloth bundle, a soldier in uniform with medals that shine faintly in the station lamps. Signs on the walls are written in English and a local script. A portrait of the Queen or King hangs above the ticket window, watching silently. As the train departs again, its carriages click and clatter into the night, crossing rivers and fields, moving through lands joined together under a rule that came from far away. Somewhere in one of the dimly lit compartments, a student stares out of the window at the passing darkness, thinking of all the things he has read about freedom, justice, and pride. Outside in villages along the tracks, people lie down to sleep under roofs of tile, thatch, or tin, breathing in a night air that carries the faint echo of wheels and whistles, a reminder that they live in a time of distant crowns and quiet, gathering questions that have not yet found their full voice. Tonight you are listening to part 15, and this part is about Jallianwala Bagh, a quiet garden in Amritsar where one terrible afternoon peeled away the last soft illusions about the Raj are. By 1919, India had already lived many decades under British rule. Railways crisscrossed the land. English schools had trained new generations of lawyers, teachers and clerks, and Indian soldiers had fought bravely for the British in distant lands during the First World War. Many educated Indians hoped that their loyalty in that terrible war would be rewarded with more freedom, more say in their own government, perhaps a step closer to self-rule. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi were beginning to knit together a broader movement, still gentle, still hopeful, that asked the British to trust Indians with more responsibility. In the city of Amritsar, in Punjab, ideas of loyalty, pride, and quiet expectation flowed through the narrow lanes, like the smell of incense and spices. People were tired, but some part of them still wanted to believe that the empire might one day open its hand and treat them as partners, not subjects. Inside many Indian hearts, there was a fragile desire at this time to find a peaceful path to dignity. They did not all agree on methods or speed. Some wanted slow reforms, others dreamed of quicker change, but most of them did not wish for bloodshed. They longed for a day when they could stand tall without fear in their own land, when their laws would be shaped by familiar hands and voices. In Amritsar, merchants, farmers, students, and holy men carried this wish with them as they prayed at the Golden Temple, bought and sold in the bazaars, and discussed news from Delhi and London over cups of tea. They wanted safety for their families, respect for their faith, and a future in which their children would not always feel the weight of being ruled by distant strangers. It was a gentle wish, like a small lamp placed in a window at dusk, hoping to be seen. Yet inside these same people, there were also quiet fears and doubts. Recent months had brought new laws from the British, like the Rowlatt Act, which allowed the government to imprison people without trial if they were suspected of committing political crimes. Many Indians felt this as a deep insult, especially after the sacrifices of the war. Some asked themselves if, after all our help, they still do not trust us, will they ever? Others worried about what might happen if protests grew stronger. Would their families be safe? Would their livelihoods survive? Leaders like Gandhi urged non-violent resistance, but for ordinary people, the line between brave protest and dangerous risk was thin and hard to see. In their hearts, the desire to stand up and the instinct to stay safe wrestled with each other, like two quiet currents meeting beneath the surface of a river. Outside their inner struggle, the world around Amritsar was tense and shifting. British officials in Punjab, nervous after the war and fearful of revolution, watched every meeting and speech with suspicion. They saw echoes of unrest in other parts of the world and worried that India might follow the same path. The Rowlatt Act fed this anxiety on both sides. Public meetings were banned in some places. Leaders were arrested or restricted. In Amritsar, the arrest of popular Indian figures stirred anger and confusion. News travelled quickly through the narrow streets, half fact, half rumour, spreading like smoke on a windy day. The British commander in the region, General Dyer, felt the weight of responsibility and fear. In his mind, the memory of 1857 and the possibility of rebellion loomed large. He saw the gathering of crowds not as a cry of hurt citizens, but as a threat that needed to be crushed before it grew. The garden of Jallianwala Bagh, an open space hemmed in by walls near the Golden Temple, would soon become the point where these different fears and desires collided. The people of Amritsar did not stand alone. Across India, there were lawyers, teachers, and spiritual leaders speaking against the Rowlatt Act and urging peaceful protest. Gandhi called for a hartal, a day of fasting and work stoppage, to show moral opposition without violence. In Amritsar itself, families and friends leaned on each other for strength. They went to the Bagh not only to protest, but also to listen, to understand, to share worry and hope. On the day that would become infamous, April 30th, 1919, it was also the festival of Baisakhi, a harvest and religious celebration for many Sikhs and Hindus. Farmers from nearby villages had come into the city, unaware of the full extent of the political tension. They entered Jallianwala Bagh in their best clothes, with children, relatives and neighbours, carrying not weapons, but the ordinary burdens of festival and life. The open space, enclosed by high walls and narrow exits, became a bowl holding thousands of human hearts beating with a mix of festivity, curiosity and concern. Then came the turning point, sudden and cold. General Dyer, informed of the gathering and determined to enforce the ban on public meetings, marched into the Bagh with armed soldiers. He did not use loudspeakers, did not clearly warn or give people a chance to leave. He moved his men into position near one of the few exits blocking the main way out and gave a simple, devastating order to fire. The soldiers obeyed. Bullets tore into the crowd, people screamed and fell, others tried to run, only to find walls or blocked paths. Some jumped into a well inside the garden to escape the firing. Many died there. The shooting went on for minutes that must have felt like an eternity. Dyer later admitted he ordered his men to aim where the crowd was thickest. When he finally stopped, hundreds lay dead or dying, and many more were wounded. The garden, which had been a place of gathering and talk, was transformed in one afternoon into a field of bodies and blood, under a sky that kept its usual indifferent colour. In the hours and days that followed, the immediate result was grief, fear, and stunned silence. Families searched for missing relatives, carried away the wounded, and tried to make sense of what had happened. British authorities imposed more punishments in Punjab. Public floggings, humiliating orders like making Indians crawl on certain streets, curfews and strict controls. In London, eventually, there were investigations and debates. Some defended Dyer as a man who had saved empire by acting decisively. Others condemned him as brutal and foolish. He was forced to leave the army, but many in Britain still praised him. To Indians, these arguments added salt to the wound. It seemed that many of those who ruled them could not feel their pain, could not see the dead of Jallianwala Bagh as individuals with hopes and families, only as a problem handled by force. For Gandhi and many other leaders, something essential changed inside that day. The belief that the British Empire might still respond to gentle loyalty with fairness began to fade. The path of seeking change through small, polite requests felt broken. A harder, clearer demand for true self-rule, Swaraj, began to glow more strongly in their minds. Over the long years that followed, Jallianwala Bagh became more than a place. It became a symbol. People who had never seen Amritsar could imagine that walled garden, the trapped crowd, the gunfire. The story was told and retold, in speeches, in homes, in quiet corners where elders whispered to the young about what the Raj was truly capable of when it felt threatened. For some, the memory fed anger. For others, it fed a sad but steady determination that such a thing should never be allowed to happen again under foreign rule. The garden itself would later be turned into a memorial with stone, flame, and inscriptions, but its strongest monument lived in the invisible space of memory, carried in hearts across the land. Tonight, if you picture Jallianwala Bagh, not at the moment of shooting, but many years later, near sunset, you might see it as it often is now, a quiet public space with trees and paths, visitors walking slowly, reading plaques, speaking in low voices. Children run, not quite understanding why their parents' faces are so serious. A tall memorial stands against the evening sky, its shape simple and still. Birds hop in the grass where people once fell. The walls are still there, but now their bricks are clean, touched by many hands. As the light softens and the sky over Amritsar turns a gentle orange, the garden seems to hold two images at once, the horror of that distant day and the calm of the present evening. Between them lies a silence filled with unspoken promise that the lives lost there will not be forgotten, and that the land that once bled so quietly will, in its own time, find a different kind of voice. Tonight you are listening to Part 16, and this part is about the Quit India movement of 1942, the moment when a tired but unbroken nation stood up and said in a single, quiet sentence, "Leave our land." By this time, India had been under the British Raj for many decades. Railways and telegraphs tied the country together. English medium schools had raised a large educated class, and earlier movements for reform and limited self-government had already stirred the air. The Indian National Congress had asked, petitioned, negotiated, and passed resolutions. Some progress had been made, but the key remained in British hands. Then came the Second World War. Without fully consulting Indian leaders, the British declared India at war alongside them. Troops were mobilised, resources were taken, and yet the basic political status of Indians, still a ruled people, did not change. In crowded trains, in fields, under the harsh sun, in student hostels and city offices, a simple feeling spread. If we are good enough to fight and die for this empire, Why are we not good enough to rule ourselves? Into this feeling stepped an old man, with a light step and a strong mind, Mahatma Gandhi, ready to give that feeling a clear, simple form. Inside millions of Indian hearts, a firm desire had slowly ripened. Complete independence, not just reforms, not just polite promises. They no longer wanted to be partners in an empire, they wanted to be free of it. Gandhi had already led movements of non-cooperation and civil disobedience, asking people to spin their own cloth, to boycott foreign goods, to refuse unfair laws. But now, in 1942, as bombs fell in distant lands and British power seemed strained, many Indians felt that the time had come to make a final, unmistakable demand. They wanted to speak with one voice, not in whispers, but in a calm, strong phrase that even a distant government could not pretend not to hear, quit India. This desire was not born from hatred of ordinary British people, but from a deep hunger for self-respect, for a day when decisions about India would be made by Indians, not in London boardrooms or viceroys' palaces. For young students, for farmers, for workers in mills and docks, that wish glowed like a coal in the chest, making their hearts beat a little faster whenever they thought of the future. Yet in this moment of rising courage, there were also quiet inner struggles. Not everyone agreed on how fast to move or how hard to push. Some older leaders, such as those in the Muslim League and certain princely states, worried about what freedom would mean for their communities in power. Within the Congress itself, there were leaders in prison, leaders in exile, leaders who feared that a strong movement during wartime might bring terrible repression. Ordinary people felt torn too. Joining a mass movement could mean losing a job, being beaten or arrested, or leaving one's family vulnerable. Parents looked at their children and wondered whether to hold them back from protests or let them step forward into history. Even Gandhi, who believed deeply in non-violence, had to wrestle with doubts. Would the people stay disciplined, or would anger and frustration spill over into acts he could not guide? In the quiet moments before the All India Congress Committee met in Bombay, many minds were like still ponds, troubled by small but insistent ripples, hope, fear, duty, and love all moving at once. Outside, the world pressed heavily on India. The British Empire was locked in a desperate struggle against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Japanese forces had swept through Southeast Asia and were near India's eastern borders. Allied leaders feared that any instability inside India might open the door to invasion. British officials and many ordinary Britons saw their empire as fighting for survival and believed they could not loosen their grip on a vast colony at such a time. They looked at Indian demands for freedom and saw danger where Indians saw justice. Troops were stationed in cities. Intelligence officers watched political meetings closely. Censorship tightened. Food and materials were diverted to the war effort. Straining markets and ship routes. Famine shadows were beginning to gather in Bengal. The external environment around India in 1942 felt like a tightening ring. War abroad, scarcity at home, and a government more anxious and suspicious than ever. In that atmosphere, any large movement would meet not gentle discussion, but the hard face of a frightened empire. Still, India was not alone. Around the world, ideas about self-determination and national rights were in the air. The Atlantic Charter, signed by Britain and the United States in 1941, talked about peoples having the right to choose their own governments, even if British leaders hesitated to apply those words to colonies. Indian soldiers fighting in far-off deserts and forests heard foreign radios speak about freedom and democracy. Indian intellectuals read newspapers describing anti-fascist struggles and wondered why the language of liberty seemed to stop at their borders. Within India, Gandhi, Nehru, Azad, and many lesser-known leaders formed networks of support. Teachers, lawyers, traders, students, and village headmen who believed in non-violent resistance and were ready to act. There were underground printers prepared to run secret presses, couriers who could carry messages down narrow lanes at night, and countless quiet supporters willing to offer shelter, food, and safe rooms when the time came. These allies, scattered and mostly unseen, were like small lamps placed in windows across the subcontinent, all waiting for the same signal. That signal came in August 1942 in Bombay. In a packed hall, under the heat of lights and hopeful eyes, the Congress passed the Quit India resolution. Gandhi rose to speak, his voice tired but steady. He did not offer a long, complicated plan. Instead, he gave a short, unforgettable call. Do or die. By this he meant not killing or war, but a firm, willing readiness to risk everything in a non-violent struggle for freedom. He asked Indians to act as if freedom had already been granted, to refuse cooperation with unjust authority everywhere, offices, factories, railways, schools, until the Raj could no longer function. People listened in silence, feeling the weight of his words settle on their shoulders like a cloak. For many, it was a moment of inner turning, from waiting to acting, from asking to insisting, from hoping to committing. Outside the hall, news of the resolution flew along telegraph lines and on the lips of messengers, carrying with it a mix of excitement and dread. A line had been crossed, gently but unmistakably. The British response was swift and harsh. Before the movement could fully organise, most top Congress leaders, including Gandhi, were arrested and locked away. Newspapers were censored, public meetings banned, but instead of stopping the movement, these arrests often pushed it into a wilder, more leaderless form. Across India, especially in the months that followed, protests broke out. Students left classrooms to march. Workers struck in mills and railways. Flags were raised on public buildings, and in some places police stations and railway lines were attacked despite Gandhi's call for non-violence. The movement became a patchwork of courage and chaos, some actions purely peaceful, others angry and destructive. British troops and police answered with Larthus bullets and mass detentions. Villages suspected of harbouring rebels were punished, homes were searched, people disappeared into jails. By 1944, the visible wave of Quit India had been crushed. The Raj still stood. But beneath that surface defeat, something important had shifted, a sense, on both sides, that British rule now rested on force alone, not on any shared belief that it was rightful or permanent. In the years just after, the war moved toward its own terrible climax, bringing devastation to many parts of the world. In India, the Bengal famine of 1943 took countless lives, and memories of both famine and repression deepened the feeling that this form of rule could not continue. When the war ended, Britain itself was exhausted, its economy strained, its public opinion increasingly less willing to bear the cost of empire. Indian leaders emerged from prison with their resolve hardened, and new voices, including those more willing to use armed struggle, had grown louder in the shadows. Quit India had not driven the British out in 1942, but it had cleared away remaining illusions. For many Indians, there was no longer any serious hope in slow, small reforms under colonial rule. Only independence felt real. For many British officials, there was now a quiet recognition that they governed a country whose people had already, in their hearts, let go of them. Tonight, if you imagine India in the late summer of 1942, you might not see a single grand battlefield, but countless small, tenter scenes. A village square at dusk, where people gather around a crackling radio, straining to catch Gandhi's words through the static. A school classroom where a young student folds his books, looks once at the chalkboard, and then walks out to join a march. A dusty railway platform where workers whisper about a strike as a train rumbles past under a sky heavy with clouds. A prison cell where an old man wrapped in a simple shawl sits cross-legged on a mat, eyes closed, breathing slowly, carrying the weight of a country's hopes in his fragile body. Above all these scattered places, the monsoon clouds drift slowly east, and night falls over fields, cities, rivers and hills. In that darkness, a quiet decision has already been made in millions of minds, that this land, with all its pains and dreams, will one day belong to itself. Tonight, you are listening to Part 17, and this part is about independence and partition in 1947, the strange, bittersweet moment when one country became two, and freedom arrived together with a deep, painful cut. By the mid-1940s, India had walked a long road of petitions, protests, prison terms, and patient organising. The Raj was still standing, but its feet were tired. The Second World War had drained Britain's strength. Bombs had fallen on London. Armies had marched across Europe and Asia, and the once confident empire now carried heavy debts and doubts. In India, too, the war years had been harsh. The Bengal famine of 1943 had taken countless lives, leaving behind memories of thin faces, empty granaries, and slow, quiet deaths along dusty roads. Yet through all this, the idea of a free India had continued to grow, moving from speeches into songs, from newspapers into village gossip, from the minds of a few leaders into the hearts of millions. By 1945 and 1946, it was no longer a distant dream. It was a presence in the air, like the smell of rain before the monsoon. Inside many Indian hearts, there now lived a strong, clear desire, not just for reform, not just for kinder rulers, but for full, real independence. People imagined waking up one morning and knowing that the flag above government buildings had changed, that the final authority over their lives was no longer a foreign king, but their own chosen leaders. They dreamed of writing their own laws, shaping schools and courts to fit their own needs, lifting the poor, healing old wounds. For some, this wish had a particular colour. They wanted a united India, where Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and others would live together under one roof, arguing and agreeing like members of a large, complicated family. For others, especially many Muslims who followed the Muslim League, the desire took a different form, a separate homeland, Pakistan, where they believed their community would be safe, respected, and free from being outvoted or overshadowed by a Hindu majority. To each of these people, their vision of the future felt like the safest path for the ones they loved. The word freedom was the same on their tongues, but under it, their dreams sometimes pointed in different directions. This difference created deep inner struggles, especially for those who loved more than one identity at once. A Muslim who had Hindu friends, a Sikh who felt attached to both neighbours and faith, a Hindu who treasured the shared culture of mixed cities like Lahore or Delhi. Many such people felt torn as talk of Hindus and Muslims hardened into talk of two nations. Leaders felt the same tension. Gandhi believed strongly in a united India where religion would be a private matter and the state would belong to all. He spoke of Hindu-Muslim unity as the core of his vision. Jawaharlal Nehru, too, wanted a modern, secular India, not split along religious lines. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, once a champion of unity, had grown convinced that Muslims needed their own state to feel safe and fully themselves. Within each of these men, there were nights of doubt. Were they protecting their people or leading them into greater danger? Were they reading the mood of the land correctly, or were they pushing too hard on a fragile fabric that might tear? Ordinary people, reading headlines or listening to speeches in crowded squares, mirrored those doubts on a quieter scale in kitchens and courtyards, wondering what kind of future their children would inherit. Outside their huts, harsh forces were building. The end of the war brought joy to many, but also unrest. Economic troubles, shortages, and the return of soldiers looking for work created pressure in cities and villages. Political negotiations between the British government, the Congress, and the Muslim League grew tense and sometimes broke down. Newspapers carried reports of communal riots, first in places like Calcutta in 1946, then elsewhere. People who had been neighbours for generations began to look at each other with fear, anger, and suspicion, urged on by rumours, hurt by past slights, or manipulated by those who used religion as a weapon. British leaders, for their part, were tired and eager to leave. Some wanted to preserve as much influence as possible. Others simply wanted to exit without being blamed for chaos. They pressed for quick solutions, timetables, and boundaries, treating a vast and complicated land as a problem to be solved on a crowded agenda. The combination of fear, hurry, and mistrust was like dry grass on a hot day, waiting for a spark. Yet India's path to freedom was not walked alone or only by famous names. Alongside Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, and others, marched countless quiet allies, school teachers who taught children to imagine a different future, poets and writers who filled the air with words of hope and warning, peasants who joined protests or refused to pay certain taxes, workers who struck in mills and on docks, civil servants who began to think of themselves not as servants of the Raj, but as future builders of an Indian state. Women, too, took their place in processions and meetings, some for the first time stepping beyond the traditional boundaries of home. In villages, local leaders mediated disputes and tried to keep peace when tensions rose. In prisons, political activists shared ideas and planned for a time when they would be free to act again. All these people formed a kind of invisible army, not of guns, but of grit, carrying the idea of independence through daily life like a small flame cupped in their hands, protecting it from wind and rain. The formal turning point came with decisions made in hurried meetings and careful announcements. In early 1947, the British sent Lord Mountbatten as the last viceroy, with instructions to transfer power quickly. Negotiations intensified. The thought of partition, dividing the land into India and Pakistan, moved from threat to plan. A British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India before, was given the job of drawing boundary lines on a map, deciding which districts would fall on which side, based largely on religious majorities. He worked in hot rooms in Delhi for only a few weeks with limited data, while outside millions of people waited without knowing that a line being scratched on paper would soon pass through their fields, towns, and even homes. On the nights of August 14th and 15, 1947, the new dominions of Pakistan and India came into being. In Karachi, in Lahore, in Delhi, speeches were made, flags raised, and crowds cheered. Nehru's voice carried through the radio in his Tryst with Destiny speech, speaking of India's long quest and its new beginning. At the stroke of midnight, many people wept with relief and pride. After so many years, the foreign crown no longer claimed this land, but even as joy rose, a darker tide moved beneath it. The announcement of the new borders came almost at the same time as independence, or even slightly after it in some places, leaving terrible confusion. In Punjab and Bengal especially, where the line cut through the villages and neighbourhoods, People scrambled to understand on which side they now belonged. Fearful of being trapped as minorities on the wrong side, millions began to move, often with only what they could carry. Hindus and Sikhs heading east and south into India from what was now Pakistan, Muslims heading west and east into Pakistan from what was now India. Trains filled with families, bundles, goats, and memories creaked along tracks under a hot, unforgiving sun. And in that chaos, terrible violence broke out. Caravans were attacked, trains stopped and turned into moving coffins. Women and children suffered unspeakable harm. Villages were burned. Neighbours who had once shared festivals and food turned on each other under the weight of fear, revenge, and the poisonous idea that the other community must be driven out. For those who lived through it, partition was not just a line on a map, it was a wound. The new governments in Delhi and Karachi struggled to cope with this wave of pain. Camps were set up for refugees. Officials worked late into the night to arrange trains, food, and fragile security. Gandhi, already old and weak, walked through the streets of Calcutta and later in parts of Delhi, trying to calm crowds, visiting relief camps, urging people to see the shared humanity in faces they had been taught to hate. He fasted, putting his own body between communities, hoping that his willingness to suffer might soften hard hearts. Some violence did lessen where he went, and in those places, at least for a time, people chose peace. But the cost on his spirit and body was heavy. Even as flags flew over new capitals and constitutions began to take shape on drafting tables, he saw clearly the price that had been paid. For him, independence without unity tasted bitter, like a fruit saved for years and then eaten with ash still on the fingers. In the months and years that followed, India and Pakistan each began the slow work of becoming themselves. In India, leaders framed a constitution promising democracy, fundamental rights, and a secular state belonging to all its citizens. Elections would come, and with them governments chosen by the people, not imposed from abroad. Roads, dams, schools, and factories were planned and built. New institutions took root. Pakistan, too, worked to define its identity and governance, facing its own internal debates and struggles. The memory of partition, however, did not fade quickly. It lived in the stories of families who had crossed borders, in old houses left behind, in empty places where other communities once lived. It sometimes hardened into continuing mistrust between the two countries, leading to wars and long, cold silences. Yet it also lived in quieter ways, in songs of longing for lost homelands, in friendships and families that stretched across borders, in writers and thinkers who tried to make sense of how joy and sorrow, pride and grief could arrive together in the same August month. Tonight, if you try to see that moment not as a date in a textbook, but as a living night, you might imagine standing on a flat rooftop in North India in mid-August 1947. The air is warm, stirred by a slight breeze. In one direction, you can hear distant shouts of celebration. Someone has raised a new flag. Drums are beating, children are laughing. Fireworks crack softly against the sky. In another direction, beyond the edge of hearing, there is the low, heavy murmur of a refugee camp. People shifting in their sleep on rough bedding, clutching bundles that hold all they have left. Above both joy and sorrow, the same stars look down, steady and indifferent. On the rooftop, an old man and a child stand side by side. The old man's eyes are wet, but he smiles as he points to the flag flying over the town. The child looks up at the night and asks a simple question. "So, are we free now?" The old man answers softly, perhaps not fully sure himself. Yes, we are. And in that fragile, uncertain answer, a new country takes its first slow breath in the dark. Tonight, you are listening to Paki Part 18, and this part is about the day Mahatma Gandhi fell in 1948, the moment when a frail, fasting old man became a silence that still lives inside India's conscience. It is only a few months after independence and partition. The new Indian flag has flown over Delhi. People have cheered in the streets, and a constitution is being planned in quiet rooms by lawyers and leaders. But the land is not at peace. Refugee trains still arrive, carrying people who have lost homes and loved ones. Camps are crowded with families trying to build new lives from almost nothing. In cities, whispers of communal hatred still move through the lanes like smoke, even after the official celebration of freedom. Gandhi, who had dreamed of an India free and united, walks through this fragile new world, wrapped in a simple shawl, his feet bare or in thin sandals, his body thin from many fasts. He is no longer the main political negotiator. That task has passed to others. But he is still, for many, the moral heart of the nation, beating quietly, trying hard not to give up. Inside Gandhi, at this time, lives a very simple, stubborn desire, not just that India should be free, but that India should be kind. He does not want freedom that tastes of revenge. He wants Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and others to live together without fear, to see each other first as human beings, and only then as members of a faith. As violence rose during partition, he did not run from the danger. Instead, he went to the places where the wounds were deepest. Calcutta, Noakhali, then Delhi, walking through streets that still smelled of smoke, visiting homes that had been broken, standing in simple courtyards and asking people to lower their voices, drop their weapons, and remember their shared humanity. At an age when most men rest in the shade, he still travels, talks, fasts, and prays. His wish is not dramatic. He just wants the killing to stop, the hate to cool, the new India to be born without more blood on its hands. In his heart, this wish feels as necessary as air. But even a man like Gandhi is not free from inner struggle. He hears criticism from many sides. Some refugees blame him for asking them to forgive those who have harmed them, feeling that his calls for peace do not understand the depth of their pain. Some Hindu nationalists see him as too soft toward Muslims, accusing him of bending too much to protect them. Some Muslims distrust him as well, seeing him as still part of a majority they fear. Even among his own followers, younger leaders now have different ideas about how to build a modern state, focusing on industry, planning, and strong government. Gandhi lives with the ache of knowing that his greatest dreams, especially of Hindu-Muslim unity, seem to be slipping further away, even as the flag he longed for finally flies. At night, in his simple room with little more than a mat, a spinning wheel, and a few papers, he must feel a deep tiredness in his bones and in his soul. Had he asked too much of human hearts? Had he failed to prevent the division he feared most? These questions do not make him stop, but they weigh on him like stones in his small cloth bag. Outside his inner world, the new India is full of tension and noise. Refugees crowd Delhi, struggling for shelter and work. Rumours of plots and conspiracies swirl. Who caused the violence? Who profited from it? Who is still secretly planning harm? In some neighbourhoods, groups of men whisper in corners, holding on to anger like a weapon. Political organisations with hard-line views grow louder, printing pamphlets, giving speeches, blaming Gandhi for weakness or for betraying the interests of Hindus by supporting payments to Pakistan and insisting on protecting Muslims inside India. For them, the dream is different. a country defined more sharply by one identity, one faith, one story. They see Gandhi's insistence on equal respect for all religions as a threat to that vision. As the government struggles with food, borders, laws, and the enormous task of building a state, it cannot fully see or control every dark corner where hatred gathers and sharpens itself. In that restless atmosphere, Gandhi's soft voice feels, to some, like a steady light, and to others, like an obstacle. Yet Gandhi is not alone in his work. Around him are people who still believe deeply in his path. His close companions, like Manu and Abha, who attend to him daily, lift him when he walks, hand him his glasses and papers. Leaders like Nehru and Patel, who sometimes disagree with him, but still respect the moral force he carries. Countless ordinary men and women who come to his prayer meetings, listening as he reads from the Gita, the Quran, the Bible, and other texts, tying them together in a simple message of love and duty. There are also invisible allies, all the people across India who, quietly and without fuss, choose not to take revenge, who protect neighbours of another faith, who rebuild shops and homes without asking who deserves it. Gandhi draws strength from these people, even if he never sees most of them. They are the living proof that his dream is not completely alone. Their quiet kindness is like an unseen net stretched under a high wire, making every step slightly less dangerous. Still, the turning point moves toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Among those who reject Gandhi's message is a man named Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist who believes that Gandhi has weakened India, betrayed Hindus, and surrendered too much to Muslims and to Pakistan. For Godse and some of his companions, Gandhi is not a father of the nation. He is a barrier to the kind of sharp, defined nation they want. They see his fasts and prayers for peace not as courage, but as pressure that forces the government to act in ways they dislike. Over time, their anger hardens from disagreement into hatred, and from hatred into a deadly resolve. They decide that removing Gandhi would be like cutting a knot, sudden, final, and freeing. So they plan. It is not a huge conspiracy with thousands of people, but a small, grim circle of minds who convince themselves that one act of violence will save their idea of India. They prepare a gun and wait for a chance. The outside world continues its busy noise, unaware that history is quietly taking aim at a frail old man who still walks unarmed among the crowds. The day comes, January 30, 1948. In Delhi, the winter air is cool, the light soft. Gandhi is staying at Birla House, a large mansion, but his own quarters are simple as always. That evening, he is scheduled, as usual, to lead a prayer meeting on the grounds. People gather, some sitting, some standing, waiting to see and hear him. He is late, delayed by conversations and by the weakness of his body. He has been on yet another fast not long before, trying to calm new waves of violence. Finally, he comes out, supported by Manu and Abha, one on each side. He is small, wrapped in his shawl, leaning slightly as he walks with his quick, short steps across the grass. The crowd begins to stir, people bow, some try to move closer for a glimpse, for a blessing. In that moment, for many, he is not a politician, not a negotiator, but a holy man, a grandfather of the nation, someone whose presence makes them feel that perhaps India's soul is still safe. Godse is in the crowd, moving forward. He has positioned himself so that Gandhi will pass near him. As Gandhi approaches, Godse bows, pressing his hands together as if in greeting, drawing close. Then, suddenly, he lifts a pistol and fires at Gandhi at close range. In the soft evening light, in a place meant for prayer, the sound of gunshots tears the air. Gandhi's body jerks. He falls back into the arms of the women beside him. Witnesses say he murmurs, "Hey Ram, "O God," as he collapses, though historians gently debate whether these were his last words or words people later wish to remember. In any case, the meaning is clear. Even at that moment, his heart turns upward, not outward in blame. The crowd panics. Some rush toward him, others toward the gunman. Chaos breaks the peaceful order of the gathering. Gandhi is carried inside. Doctors are called, but the wounds are too great. In a short time, the fragile, beating heart that had carried India's hopes for decades is still. The news spreads through Delhi and then across India like a dark wind. Radios carry the announcement. Newspapers rush to print extra editions. In small houses and big offices, people stop what they are doing as words reach them. Gandhi is dead. Gandhi has been shot. Some refuse to believe it at first. Others, hearing it, feel as if a light has gone out in the room. Nehru's voice breaks on the radio as he tells the nation that the light has gone out of our lives, though he adds that in truth it will shine on through thousands of little flames. In villages, people gather in the evening around lanterns and listen in silence. In some places, shops close, bells ring, flags are lowered to half-mast. For many, the grief is not just for a leader, but for what his death seems to say about the new India, that even after independence, hatred could reach the very person who had tried hardest to keep the country's heart gentle. It feels, for a while, as if the nation is a child who has just lost a parent, standing alone in a crowded but suddenly cold house. In the days that follow, India walks through that grief slowly. Gandhi's body is taken in a procession, followed by crowds that seem to stretch endlessly, some weeping openly, others walking with heads bowed and lips moving in silent prayers. His ashes are later immersed in rivers, their water carrying his remains into the land he loved. The government moves quickly to arrest Godse and his accomplices, and they are tried and punished. Some people, in their pain, call for broad revenge against those who shared his ideology, but others remember Gandhi's own teachings and try to resist the pull of collective blame. Over time, statues of Gandhi rise in cities and towns. His face appears on currency. His words are printed in school books. He becomes a symbol, sometimes warmly remembered, sometimes uncomfortably sharp, reminding leaders and citizens that the true test of a free nation is not only how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies and its weakest members. Tonight, if you stand in imagination at the place where he was shot, now called Gandhi Smriti, you might see a simple path marked by footprints cast in stone, showing his last walk to the prayer ground. The grass is trimmed, the trees quiet. Visitors move slowly, speaking in low voices, reading small signs, looking at photographs and simple objects he once used, a spinning wheel, spectacles, a walking stick. Birds call softly in the late light. If you stand very still as the sun sinks and the air cools, you might feel not the noise of gunshots, but a deep steady hush, as if the land itself is still holding its breath, trying to decide again and again whether to walk the harder path he chose, the path of courage without hatred, strength without cruelty, and love that does not close its eyes to suffering. In that quiet, the absence of one thin old man feels strangely large, like a space that invites every new generation to ask, in its own way, what kind of country it wishes to be. Tonight you are listening to part 19, and this part is about the long, slow work of building the Republic of India, how a wounded, newly free country tried to turn pain into laws, hunger into plans, and memory into a quiet promise to its children. After Gandhi's body was carried away and the ash of partition slowly settled, India stood on the edge of something both frightening and full of possibility. Ordinary days under self-rule. The British flag was gone. The last viceroy had left. There was no one else to blame or to obey. In Delhi, a new government worked in hot rooms and long meetings, and in almost every corner of the land people asked themselves the same simple question in different words. What kind of India will we now choose to become? In the halls of the old legislative building, men and women of many backgrounds gathered as the Constituent Assembly, with B.R. Ambedkar, sharp-minded, scarred by the cruelty of caste, and stubbornly committed to justice, taking the lead in shaping a document that would hold the country together. Outside those halls, the streets were full of refugees, merchants, rickshaw pullers, clerks, farmers, children, all going about their days. Inside, pens moved across paper, crafting a new spine for a country that wanted to stand tall without cracking. The desire that pulsed through these efforts was not loud or showy. It was a wish for a home that belonged to everyone, where nobody would be untouchable by law, and where the state would protect the dignity of even the smallest voice. Yet the people trying to shape this republic carried their own quiet struggles within. Nehru, now the country's first Prime Minister, felt the pull between his dreams of heavy industry and science and the soft memory of Gandhi's spinning wheel and village self-reliance. Ambedkar wrestled with the knowledge that the majority of the assembly did not feel the sting of caste as he did, even as he tried to write protections for Dalits and other marginalised people into the core of the law. Leaders from different regions feared that too much central power might crush their local languages and identities. Others feared that too little central strength might let the still fragile country fall apart into quarrelling pieces. Ordinary citizens faced their own inward doubts. They had grown up under empire, where decisions came from above and far away. Now they were told that their vote, their voice, would count. Some wondered if their choices truly mattered, or if new elites would simply replace old ones. In many hearts, hope and suspicion sat together like uneasy neighbours at a wedding, each glancing at the other, unsure which one would stay the longest. Outside these inner debates, the world pressing on India was harsh and demanding. Fields were often exhausted, tools old, irrigation limited. Many people lived on the thin edge between enough food and not enough. Floods and droughts still came, wiping out harvests in some places while others prospered. Borders, newly drawn, were not quiet lines on a map, but tense, armed edges, in Kashmir in the northeast, along the long curve between India and Pakistan. The Cold War grew beyond India's shores, two superpowers tugging at the world with invisible ropes of fear and influence, and each looked at new nations like India as pieces on a larger board. Famines still threatened, epidemics could sweep through crowded towns. The dream of democracy, written in careful ink in the Constitution, had to live in this real landscape of hunger, illness, and anxiety. Abroad, some doubted that such a poor, diverse country could keep free elections going for long. They expected chaos, coups, or a slow slide into dictatorship. India's experiment would not be judged in speeches alone, but in the stubbornness of its daily survival. To meet this world, the young republic leaned on many allies, some visible, some almost invisible. There were the planners and economists who sat with maps and charts, shaping 5-year plans that tried, in calm numbers, to translate suffering into policy. Dams here, steel plants there, support for village industries alongside new highways and power lines. There were scientists and engineers who built laboratories and factories, started atomic energy programs, and laid the foundations for space research, believing that even a poor country had the right to look up at the sky and imagine its own satellites moving among the stars. There were agronomists and farmers who would later, in the Green Revolution, experiment with new seeds, fertilizers, and irrigation techniques to pull more grain from the soil and push back the shadow of famine. Teachers in small schools, speaking in many tongues, became quiet pillars of the new state, telling children stories about a constitution and a flag about equality and rights, even if those words sometimes felt thin against the roughness of daily life. And underneath all of this, millions of unnoticed hands, women drawing water, men repairing tools, children helping in fields and homes, kept the actual heartbeat of the country steady while leaders argued and planned. There were turning points that showed both the strain and the stubborn resilience of this project. In 1950, when the Constitution finally came into force and India became a republic, the change was quiet but deep. No longer a dominion under a distant king, but a state saying, "We govern ourselves." Each election that followed became another test. Ballot boxes carried on bullock carts and boats through jungles and up mountains to reach villages where people lined up in sun and dust to press their mark next to a symbol on a paper. Many could not read the names, but they knew the signs: a lamp, a hand, a wheel, a lotus. The fact that these elections kept happening again and again without being cancelled became its own kind of miracle, performed not by one hero, but by an entire people. At the same time, wars with neighbours tested the borders, and internal conflicts over language, over state boundaries, over rights, showed how easily the fabric could fray. There were years when emergency rule was declared, civil liberties were suspended and critics jailed. The fear that democracy might be only a thin curtain over brute power felt, for a while, very real. But when emergency ended and elections were held, the same people who had once trusted and cheered their leaders proved that they could also remove them with votes, not bullets. In that quiet act, behind the screen of a polling booth, the Republic learned something about its own strength. As decades passed, the texture of Indian life kept changing. The Green Revolution filled some granaries, but also brought new inequalities and environmental strains. Cities grew wide and tall, swallowing villages at their edges, filling with cars, buses, concrete, and the glow of cinema posters, and later television screens. New industries rose: textiles, steel, pharmaceuticals, and eventually, in glass towers and cramped offices, an information technology world that connected Indian minds to keyboards and screens far beyond the country's borders. In markets, saris hung next to jeans, old spices next to new packaged foods. In households, grandparents spoke of ration cards and lanterns, while grandchildren swiped at smartphones watching videos from around the planet. Caste discrimination was challenged in law, but lingered in many practices. Laws for women's rights were written, yet violence and injustice still appeared in the news like bruises that would not fully heal. Corruption scandals, communal riots, and political violence stained the promise of the Constitution, reminding everyone that a piece of paper, however noble, cannot enforce its own words. And yet, each time, there were also marches for peace, court cases, newspaper editorials, and voices on radios and television arguing, pleading, demanding better. The Republic stumbled often, but each stumble also revealed people still willing to pull it back upright. Tonight, if you try to see this long, complicated chapter not as a list of policies and dates, but as a single, soft image, you might imagine standing on the edge of a small Indian town just before dawn in the present day. The sky is dark blue, beginning to pale. In the distance, you can see an old water tower from the early years of development, and beyond it, the faint outline of a new cell phone tower blinking a tiny red light. A narrow road passes between fields where electric pumps hum quietly, pulling water up for crops that earlier generations feared might fail. Along the road, you might glimpse a school building with peeling paint, but a bright sign, a small health clinic with its light already on, a tea stall where the first customers gather, some in worn dhotis, some in shirts and trousers, one perhaps in a college hoodie with headphones around his neck. A radio at the stall crackles with news about elections, court decisions, monsoon forecasts. The men and women listening shake their heads, laugh, argue, fall silent, then order another glass of tea. Above them, the first rays of the sun push over the horizon, touching brick, tin, leaves and faces. This is the India the Republic has been slowly building, imperfect, uneven, sometimes unjust, but still breathing, still arguing with itself in 100 languages, still trying, in its own halting way, to make the promise written in its constitution a little more real with each new day. And in that cool, early light, before the heat and noise rise, the land seems to pause for a moment, as if drawing breath for whatever long story tomorrow will bring. Tonight you are listening to Wachiam Part 20 Sa'on, and this part is about the soft lessons that India's long history quietly offers to anyone who is awake with the night, wondering how to live today. We've walked together from the silent bricks of the Indus cities to Ashoka's pillars, from the calm stargazing of the Gupta age to the clash of Alexander at the frontier, from the high towers of Delhi sultans and Mughal domes to the counting houses of the company, from crowds in Jallianwala Bagh to the midnight when the flag was raised, and the day when Gandhi fell. Now we find ourselves in the present, in a world of phones and screens, highways and airports where the past can seem very far away. And yet, if you listen beneath the hum of traffic and the buzz of notifications, there is still a low, steady murmur, like the sound of a deep river underground. That murmur is the memory of all those lives that came before, folded into the soil of India and into the stories we have just shared. Tonight, we are no longer watching kings and sultans, emperors or conquerors. We are simply watching one ordinary person, someone a bit like you, standing in the doorway of their home, at the edge of a modern Indian town, looking at the dark sky and asking quietly, what do I do with all this history? What does it ask of me now? Inside this person, and inside many people today, there is a gentle but powerful desire to live a life that makes sense in a world that often feels confused and loud. They want to earn enough to care for their families, to feel safe when they walk at night, to be respected for who they are, to belong to something larger than themselves without being swallowed by it. They want their children to go to good schools, but also to keep some of the old songs and stories alive. They want to be proud of their country, but not blind to its mistakes. In the quiet of their own minds, they dream of a future where progress does not mean losing kindness, where modernity does not mean cutting all roots, where success does not require stepping on others. This desire is not written in any law book, but it beats softly in many chests, from big cities with glass towers to small villages, where the sky still looks huge. It is in a way the same desire that moves so many of the people we have met in this long journey. Ashoka seeking a better way to rule after seeing the dead at Kalinga, poets wanting peace to write their verses, farmers wanting fair taxes, freedom fighters wanting dignity. The faces change, the clothes change, the tools change, but the wish to live with meaning stays. Still, even with this wish, there are quiet battles inside. A young student scrolling on a phone sees news of corruption, violence, cruelty, and feels anger rise, and also a heavy tiredness. What can one person do? They ask. An office worker wants to be honest, but sees others climbing faster by cutting corners, and feels a tempting whisper, why not do the same? A parent wants to teach their children to respect everyone, but hears harsh words about other communities on television or in their own neighbourhood, and sometimes those words try to plant themselves in the soft soil of the child's mind. People feel pulled between pride and humility, between patience and impatience, between fear and trust. They remember Gandhi's face on coins, perhaps, or lines from school books about great leaders, but in daily life, the path of courage without hate, strength without cruelty, truth without self-righteousness can feel very narrow and steep. Inside, many of us sit at a small crossroads where two voices argue quietly, one that says, protect only your own, take what you can. The world is harsh, and another that says, open your hand a little, see yourself in others. You are part of something bigger. The struggle between these two voices is the new battlefield of history, and it is not fought in fields with cannons, but in bedrooms, buses, offices and online chats, one heart at a time. Outside these inner storms, the world around modern India is full of strong winds. There are the challenges of climate change, hotter summers, uncertain rains, rivers stressed by dams and pollution, forests shrinking. There is the rush of technology that can connect people instantly, but also spread lies and hatred faster than any old rumour in a bazaar. There are sharp lines of wealth and poverty, tall apartments rising next to crowded slums, air-conditioned malls, not far from farmers watching the sky for rain. There are global pressures, trading rules, wars in distant regions, economic waves that can lift some boats and drown others. There are unresolved questions from the past about caste, about religion, about language, about whose story is told and whose is forgotten. These outside forces can make a person feel small and helpless, like a tiny boat on a big choppy sea, and yet the same land that has seen so many storms still stands beneath their feet. The same rivers that reflected Gupta, stars and Mughal moons still flow under modern bridges. The same soil that took in the footprints of Ashoka, the dust of Plassey, the blood of Jallianwala Bagh, the ashes of Gandhi, now holds electric poles and concrete foundations, and still grows rice and wheat, still opens each dawn as if nothing is impossible. To live in this world, modern India has many allies, some old, some new. There is the Constitution, a thick book that when opened says in calm words that all are equal under the law, that every citizen has certain rights, that no one is untouchable in the eyes of the state. There are teachers who stay late to help one more student understand a problem, nurses and doctors who work in crowded wards, drivers who carry strangers safely through night traffic, farmers who bend over fields so that cities can eat. There are old stories, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Sufi poems, Bhakti songs, Buddhist teachings that whisper in different ways that greed and hatred always burn the hand that holds them. There are new stories, novels, films, songs on cheap headphones that explore love across boundaries, friendships that cross religion or class, characters who struggle and change. There are small acts of courage, someone stepping between two angry people to calm them, a village deciding that no one will be denied water from the local well, a group of citizens planting trees along a dirty road, a child asking gently why someone is being treated unfairly. These are not big dramatic allies like armies or emperors. They are more like the tiny lamps you see in festival nights, placed on windowsills and doorsteps, each one fragile, but together making a pattern of light. At some point, for each person, there comes a quiet turning that is not announced on the news. It might be a moment when you decide not to laugh at a cruel joke about another community, or when you choose to tell the truth, even though a small lie would be easier. Or when you read about a famine, a riot, or a disaster, and instead of turning the page, you let yourself feel the sorrow and ask, is there anything I can do, however small? In that moment, the great weight of Indian history, everything we have walked through in these 20 parts, leans forward and whispers a few gentle lessons. It reminds you that empires built only on fear and greed do not last, that leaders who listen to their conscience, like Ashoka or some of the builders of the Republic, can change the direction of millions of lives, that violence, even when it seems powerful, leaves deep scars that take generations to heal. That true courage can look very quiet, like a man sitting to fast for peace, or a woman leading her children across a new border without letting hatred take root in their hearts. The climax of history is not any one battle or law or speech. It is this slow, tender realization inside ordinary people that the future is being shaped softly by what they choose to love and what they refuse to become. And so we come to the soft, open end of our journey. India today is not perfect. No country is. It carries old wounds and new worries, bright successes and deep inequalities. But if you zoom out gently and look at this land as if from a hill at dusk, you see something quietly remarkable. A huge, diverse country that has survived invasion, empire, famine, partition, assassination, and endless argument, and still wakes up each morning to cook food, open shops, ring school bells, hold elections, celebrate festivals, and tell stories. The greatest lesson its history offers is not that it has all the answers, but that it keeps trying. It tells you that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems small, that listening is a form of strength, that remembering the pain of others can keep you from repeating old cruelties in new clothes. It suggests that you, lying there now in the soft dark, are part of this story too, not as an audience only, but as a quiet author of tomorrow's chapter, through the way you speak, vote, work, and treat the people near you. If you are still awake, you might imagine India as a great breathing being, lying under the night sky, its cities like clusters of fireflies, its villages like small glowing embers, its rivers like dark, shining threads. Somewhere a train passes with a low distant sound, somewhere a temple bell rings, somewhere a call to prayer floats into the cool air, somewhere a child laughs in their sleep. All of these sounds braid together into a single, long, soft song that has been singing for thousands of years. Thank you for walking through this song, step by slow step, from the first stones to this present breath. Now, as you close your eyes, you can let the voices of the past grow quiet, like waves settling after a long tide. The night is still, the sky is wide, and the story of India continues, gently, patiently, in the dark, waiting for the light of another morning.